She was born without a wolf, but her secret silver blood made the cruel Alpha King bow. The chain around Seraphine's wrist was too tight. It had been too tight since the moment the guard clicked it shut at the edge of the Iron Moon Pack's territory, and in the 2 days since, it had rubbed the skin raw. She did not complain. Complaining would have given them something to laugh about, and she had decided a long time ago that she would never give the people of Iron Moon anything they could use against her. She sat in the back of the wooden cart, her knees pulled close, her dark hair falling loose around her face. 4 other wolves sat with her, young men and women, chosen by Alpha Greystone as tribute wolves for the royal court. They all had their wolves. She could see it in the way they held themselves, that quiet animal sureness behind their eyes, the way their posture shifted whenever the cart hit a bump, adjusting without thinking, the wolf inside them balancing without effort. Seraphine had no wolf. She had never shifted, not once. Not even a flicker. She was 21 years old, and every year that passed without her wolf arriving had been another year of being reminded, loudly and often, that she was less than everyone around her. In the Iron Moon Pack, a wolf without their animal half was not considered a wolf at all. She was called a hollow. It was not a kind word. The reason she was on this cart was simple and humiliating. Each year, Alpha Greystone sent a group of young wolves to the Iron Throne as tribute, a tradition that had existed for 80 years, and one that no pack dared break. The tribute wolves served in the royal court for 2 years, and then returned home. It was considered an honor, or at least that was what people said. Most of the wolves who came back were quiet, and changed in ways they did not speak about. This year, Greystone had pulled Seraphine's name from the list himself. Everyone had understood the joke immediately. He was sending the wolfless girl to the court of the Alpha King. She would arrive as tribute, and would almost certainly be turned away the moment they discovered she had no wolf to offer. At best, she would be returned to Iron Moon in disgrace. At worst, well, no one said the worst part out loud, but they thought it, and she had seen it on their faces when the chain was locked around her wrist. Her stepmother had not even come to see her off. The forest on both sides of the road had grown thicker since they crossed the border into royal territory. The trees here were enormous, their trunks wider than houses, their canopies so dense that sunlight came through in thin, scattered pieces, falling in patches on the road like broken glass. The air smelled different here, older, like something had lived in it for a very long time, and had never quite left. Seraphine watched the trees and tried not to think about the wrist. The young man sitting across from her, his name was Owen, she had gathered from the conversation he was having with the girl beside him, had been looking at her sideways for the last hour. He had the build of someone who had been shifting since he was 14, which probably meant he had, and he wore his confidence the way people do when they have never had reason to doubt themselves. He looked at her the way most Iron Moon wolves looked at her, like she was a problem that hadn't been properly removed yet. "You know they are going to send you straight back," he said finally, apparently deciding that quiet observation wasn't satisfying enough. Seraphine looked at him. She did not say anything. "I am serious," Owen continued. "The royal court takes tribute wolves who can actually shift. They will take one look at you and—" "I heard you," she said. He blinked. People were usually more unsettled when she answered simply and without emotion. They expected tears or anger, and when they got neither, they lost their footing. Owen sat back a little and said nothing more. The girl beside him, whose name Seraphine did not yet know, glanced at her with something that might have been curiosity. The cart jolted suddenly over a hole in the road, and the guard sitting at the front swore and yanked the reins. Seraphine braced herself with her chained hand, and felt the metal bite harder into her skin. A thin line of blood appeared on the inside of her wrist, just below the iron cuff. She watched it form. It was a small thing, a single thin line of red that curved along the bone like a question mark. Then it changed. She saw it happen but did not understand it at first. The red shifted. Not all of it, just the leading edge, the part that had pooled in the small hollow of her wrist. It went silver, not gray, not pale, silver, like the underside of a coin held up to moonlight. It shone faintly even in the dim light coming through the trees, and for one breathless moment, it was the most unusual thing she had ever seen. Then it was gone. The blood went red again, and the cut dried, and if anyone had been watching, they might have missed it. But someone had been watching. The guard at the front of the cart, not the one driving, but the second one. A man named Fletch, who had the sunken, watchful look of someone who had spent years noticing things other people missed, had his head turned. His eyes were on her wrist. His face was very still in a way that told her the stillness was deliberate. Seraphine pressed her wrist against her knee and looked away, at the trees, at the shifting patches of sunlight, at anything other than Fletch's face. Her heartbeat was doing something uncomfortable. She slowed it deliberately, a technique she had learned years ago when the taunting got loud and she needed to stay composed. She focused on her breathing, on the rhythm of the cart, on the smell of the old forest. By the time they came around a wide bend in the road and the first towers of the Iron Throne's outer wall came into view above the tree line, her face was calm. Whatever had happened to her blood was already folded away somewhere private inside her, tucked beneath everything else she carried and never showed. The Iron Throne's palace was not beautiful the way places were beautiful in stories. It did not gleam or shine. It sat on top of a black stone ridge, like something that had grown there over centuries, rather than been built, its towers dark and irregular, its walls the color of old iron after rain. It was enormous and heavy, and it had the look of a place that had survived things, wars and storms and time, without softening at any of them. The cart passed through 2 checkpoints. At the first, papers were examined, and the guard captain ran through the list of tribute names without looking at any of them. At the second, the wolves were made to stand outside the cart while a pair of court assessors walked slowly down the line. The assessors wore gray robes with silver thread at the collar. They were not young. The woman had sharp eyes and moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact task many times and had stopped finding it interesting long ago. The man was taller and slower and kept his hands folded at his waist. When they reached Seraphine, they stopped. The woman looked at the chain on her wrist first, then up at her face. "Name," she said. "Seraphine Ashwood." The woman checked her list. Found the name. Something moved across her expression, not quite surprise, but a version of it. "Pack of origin?" "Iron Moon." The woman looked at her colleague. The man's eyes had gone to Seraphine's wrist, the same way Fletch's had, and Seraphine felt something cold move through her stomach. She had assumed the blood had dried too quickly to be noticed. She had apparently assumed wrong. "Step to the side," the woman said. Seraphine stepped to the side. Owen and the 3 others were processed through without incident and led through the inner gate. Seraphine stood where she had been placed and waited. Fletch approached the assessors. He spoke to them in a voice too low for her to hear clearly. She caught fragments. "Silver. And I saw it. And only a second." The woman's sharp eyes came back to Seraphine. The man was already writing something on a separate piece of paper. She was taken not through the main gate but through a smaller door in the wall to the left, flanked by 2 guards who were polite in the mechanical way of people following protocol. She was brought through a corridor into a receiving room with stone walls and no windows, where she was given water and told to wait. She sat. She drank the water. She looked at her wrist. The cut had completely closed. There was no mark at all where the chain had broken the skin. No scar, no scab, just smooth skin, as if the cut had never happened. She had healed quickly all her life, faster than was normal even for wolves. But this was something else. The blood had done something she did not have a word for. The door opened and a man came in. He was not a guard. He was dressed in clothes that were expensive in a quiet way. Dark fabric, perfect fit, and he wore no visible weapon, which in a place like this probably meant he was more dangerous than the people who did. He had gray at his temples and the kind of face that might have been pleasant once, a long time ago, before whatever had made it the way it was now. His eyes were pale and very observant. "Seraphine Ashwood," he said, sitting down across from her without asking permission or introducing himself. "Born in Iron Moon, no shift record, no wolf registry entry." He said it the way you would read a description of an object. "Do you know why you are in this room, rather than the orientation hall with the other tributes?" "I can guess," she said. "Then guess. You want to know about the blood." He studied her for a moment. "What do you know about it?" "Nothing," she said. That was the first time. That was true. It was also the most frightening sentence she had ever spoken aloud, because saying it made it real, in a way that thinking it had not. The man's name, she would find out later, was Lord Vera. He was the court physician, the king's head of biological study, and the person responsible for assessing unusual cases brought before the throne. He would not tell her any of this tonight. Tonight he simply looked at her for a long time, as if reading something in her face that she did not know was written there. And then he said, "You will be assigned quarters in the East Corridor. You will not leave them without escort. You will eat when food is brought. You will not speak to other members of the court until you are told you may." She looked at him steadily. "That does not sound like the arrangement for a tribute, Wolf." "It is not," he agreed. He stood, smoothed the front of his jacket, and went to the door. Before he opened it, he turned back once. "One more question. When the blood changed color, were you afraid?" Seraphine thought about it honestly. "I was surprised," she said. "That is different." Vera looked at her for one more second, then he nodded, very slightly, as if she had answered something he had not actually asked, and left. Seraphine sat alone in the stone room, and listened to the sound of the palace around her. Somewhere far away, through walls and corridors she had not yet seen, there were footsteps and voices, and the distant sound of something metal being set down on stone. She pressed her palm flat against her knee, and looked at the inside of her wrist where the blood had gone silver. She had spent 21 years being told she had nothing. No wolf, no power, no place, no future worth mentioning. Every person in Ironmoon had looked at her and seen absence. She was beginning to think they had been looking at the wrong thing. The East Corridor was small and cold, and smelled of stone that had been damp for a very long time. Her room had a narrow bed, a basin, a single high window too small to climb through and too high to see out of, without standing on the bed. She stood on the bed and looked out at a slice of the night sky. One star, visible between two towers, that was all. She got down. She sat on the edge of the mattress. She did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about her mother. Elena Ashwood had died when Seraphine was 7, from a fever that moved fast and gave no warning. Seraphine's memory of her was made of small things: the weight of her hand on the top of her head, the particular way she said Seraphine's name, with the emphasis on the middle, the soft, careful way she checked Seraphine's hands and arms before bed each night, running her fingers along Seraphine's skin, as if she was looking for something. At the time, Seraphine had thought it was just what mothers did. Now, sitting in a stone room at the edge of the most powerful pack territory in the known world, she thought about those nightly checks differently. She thought about them the way you think about something when you finally have a new piece of information that changes the shape of what you already knew. Her mother had been looking at her skin, every night, looking for something that might show up there, something silver, perhaps, something she had been afraid of. Seraphine lay back on the narrow mattress and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would come, whether she was ready for it or not. That had always been true. She had learned early that the best thing to do was meet it with her eyes open and her face calm, and her mind already a step ahead of whatever was walking toward her. She closed her eyes. The single star outside the window disappeared behind a cloud, and the corridor went fully dark, and somewhere deep in the walls of the Iron Throne's palace, something very old and very quiet began to move toward the surface of the girl, lying still in the East Corridor, pressing against her skin from the inside, like a tide learning the shape of a new shore. It was patient. It had been waiting for 21 years. It could wait one more night. She woke before the guard came. That was intentional. She had always been a light sleeper, and in Ironmoon she had trained herself to wake before the household stirred, because the early hours were the only hours that belonged entirely to her. She washed her face in the basin, braided her hair back with the tie she kept looped around her wrist, and sat on the edge of the bed waiting. The guard came an hour after dawn. He was young, barely older than her, with the careful posture of someone new to a position they did not yet feel certain in. He brought a tray of food, bread, hard cheese, a cup of warm broth, and set it inside the door without speaking. He was turning to leave when Seraphine said, "What is your name?" He stopped, turned back, clearly not expecting to be spoken to. "Corin," he said, after a brief hesitation. "Thank you, Corin," she said. He left, but she noticed, as he pulled the door shut, that he did it more gently than he had the night before. Small things. She had always understood small things. In Ironmoon, where she had no power and no protection, she had learned to work in the small spaces between events. A steady look here, a quiet word there, the art of being remembered well by people who had no reason to remember her at all. It was not manipulation. It was survival that looked like courtesy. She ate the bread and drank the broth and sat with the hard cheese in her hand, looking at the stone wall, thinking. Vera had not told her what he intended to do with her. He had told her not to leave and not to speak to anyone, which told her she was being contained rather than processed. Tribute wolves went through orientation and then assignment. She had not gone through either. That meant she existed, at the moment, in a space between categories. And in Seraphine's experience, being between categories was both the most dangerous and the most useful place to be. No one knew what to do with you, and that meant no one was entirely watching. She pressed the pad of her thumb against the inside of her wrist, where the blood had changed. The skin was smooth, warm. She pressed a little harder, and for just a moment, half a second, the length of a blink, she felt something answer. Not pain, not heat. Something more like pressure from the inside, like a second heartbeat sitting just below the surface of her skin, tapping once against her thumb and then going still again. Seraphine let out a slow breath. Whatever was living inside her blood, it was aware of her, and she was becoming increasingly certain it had been there all along. On the third morning, Vera came back. He did not knock. He opened the door with the confidence of someone who did not consider it necessary, walked in, and set a leather case on the small table in the corner of the room. The case was dark and narrow and had latches on 3 sides. He opened it with practiced hands, and Seraphine saw inside it a row of glass vials, each one no longer than her finger, each one empty, set into molded holders. "Hold out your left hand," he said. Seraphine looked at the vials. She looked at Vera. "You want my blood? I need a sample to understand what we are dealing with," he said. "It will not hurt." "Most things that hurt begin with someone saying that," she said. His expression did not change. "The king has been informed that you are here. He has been told that you may be an unusual case. He is interested in the results of my assessment. I can either deliver those results with your cooperation, or I can deliver them after discussing with him how you chose not to cooperate. I would think carefully about which outcome you prefer." She had spent 2 days in that small room, eating bread and broth and pressing her thumb against her wrist, and she had decided sometime in the early hours of the second morning that passive waiting was a luxury she could not afford. Information moved in only one direction if she stayed still. She needed to be in the current, not watching from the bank. She held out her left hand. Vera worked quickly, and without the warmth of someone who considered her anything other than a subject. He cleaned a small area on the inside of her arm, made a precise, shallow cut, smaller than the one the chain had made, and caught the blood in the first vial. It came out red, ordinary, dark red. He sealed the vial, set it aside, and waited. He was watching the cut. Seraphine watched it too. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, at the edge of the cut where the blood was thinnest, the color shifted. It happened slowly this time, slowly enough that she could actually see it, the red thinning, going pale at the edges, and then brightening, not dimming, brightening, into something that looked like it was lit from underneath. Silver. Unmistakably, clearly, impossibly silver. Vera did not make a sound. His hands were very still. He uncapped the second vial and held it to the cut, collecting the silver blood separately from the red, and his hands were steady, but Seraphine noticed, with the particular attention she gave to faces and hands, that his breathing had changed. He was very carefully keeping it even, the way you would if something had just exceeded what you prepared yourself to see. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "I saw it for the first time on the road here," she said. "That was true. I do not know if it has been happening longer without my knowledge." He sealed the second vial. He sealed the case. He stood straight and looked at her with the first expression she had seen on his face, that was something other than professional distance. It was not warmth. It was calculation, so deep it looked almost like wonder. "You should eat more," he said, and left. She stared at the door. That night she heard movement in the corridor that was different from the usual guard rotations. Footsteps that were quieter, more deliberate, the kind that came from someone who knew how to move, and was choosing to move carefully. They stopped outside her door, and she sat up in the dark and listened. Nothing entered, nothing knocked. After perhaps a minute the footsteps continued, slow and unhurried, moving away down the corridor and disappearing. She lay back down. She told herself it was probably a night patrol. She did not entirely believe it. The next morning Corin brought her tray as usual, but this time he was accompanied by a second guard who stood in the doorway while Corin set the tray down. The second guard did not look at her directly. He looked at the room, catalogued it, and looked at his colleague, as if checking something off a mental list. Then they both left. She was being assessed without being asked questions. She understood that. Someone above Vera had made a decision about how to handle her, and the change in guard behavior was the first visible edge of that decision. On the 5th day, she was moved. Not far, just deeper into the palace, away from the east corridor, and into a set of rooms that were considerably less bare. There were 2 rooms instead of 1, and a window that actually opened, and furniture that had not been chosen purely for function. She stood in the larger room and looked around it, and then looked at the guard who had accompanied her. "Why?" she asked. "Orders," he said. She stopped asking. The new rooms were in the king's wing. She understood that from the way the corridors looked, the stone was the same age and quality as the rest of the palace, but the maintenance here was different, more careful, the kind of attention that came from proximity to power. The tapestries on the walls were old but preserved. The floors were swept clean, with a precision that suggested discipline rather than pride. She was given clothes, a set of plain, well-made garments, nothing elaborate, but clearly not the worn things that had come with her from Iron Moon. She changed into them and felt, for reasons she did not examine too closely, slightly more like herself. Clothes that fit correctly were a small thing. They were also not a small thing. On the 6th day, she heard his voice for the first time. She had her window open. It faced a courtyard she could not see into directly, but she could hear it, and the voice came from below. It was not raised. It did not need to be. It had the quality of a voice that people arranged their own volume around, rather than competing with, a voice that was used to being heard without effort. It said something short and flat to whoever he was speaking to, and then there was a silence that had the particular weight of an instruction being received. She did not look out the window. She moved away from it instead, back to the table, where she had been thinking through everything she had gathered in 6 days. What she knew, she had silver blood. Vera wanted it badly enough to overlook normal protocol. She had been moved to the king's wing, which was either protection or closer observation, or both. No one had told her what she was here for now, which meant they had not yet decided. What she did not know, what silver blood meant, why it mattered, what her mother had known about it, what Vera intended to do with the samples he had collected, what the king had been told and what he thought of it. What she needed to know, all of it. She had one resource available to her, Corin. Not because he would tell her anything, he was careful and clearly well trained, but because he was young, and he had heard her say thank you, and he had been gentle with the door. Small things, again. The current moved, in small things. When he brought the evening meal, she asked him, "Is there a library in this wing?" He set the tray down, thought about it. "There is a reading room, 2 corridors east. Am I permitted to use it?" He looked uncertain. "I would need to ask." "Please do," she said. The next morning he told her she was permitted to use the reading room between the 2nd and 4th hour of the morning, when traffic in the corridor was minimal, and she could be accompanied without drawing attention. She almost smiled, almost. The reading room was not large, but it was well stocked, and, more importantly, its collection was not organized by subject in any way that suggested it had been curated for general use. These were working texts, research texts, the kind of collection that accumulated around someone who actually read. She found the section on bloodline histories on the 3rd shelf from the right. She worked her way through the spines without pulling anything out, reading titles, and stopped at a narrow volume bound in something that was not quite leather, pressed flat between 2 thicker books, as if it had been set there and forgotten, or perhaps set there deliberately, where it would be overlooked. The title on the spine was simply, Moonblood, Notes on Lineage and Suppression. She did not take it off the shelf that day. She noted its position, and moved to a different section, and read something entirely unremarkable for an hour, and then Corin brought her back to her rooms. That night she lay in the darkness of her new room, and thought about the word printed on that spine, suppression. It was not a word that appeared in the title of a history. It was a word that appeared in the title of a manual. Someone had written down how to suppress it, which meant someone had needed to. which meant it had happened before. She thought about her mother's hands checking her skin each night. She thought about a fever that came fast and gave no warning. She thought about the word suppress and the way Vera's breathing had changed when the blood went silver, and the careful, too careful way the palace had rearranged itself around her in 6 days. She was not a hollow. She had never been a hollow. She had been hidden. The footsteps came again that night, quieter than before, or perhaps she was just more awake this time, her hearing sharper, her body very still, in a way that made the world louder. They stopped outside her door. One set of footsteps, alone. A long pause. Long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. She got to 11, and then the footsteps moved on. She did not know yet who it was. She had suspicions, but suspicions were not knowledge, and she was done accepting things she could not verify. In the morning she would go back to the reading room. She would take the narrow book from the shelf and sit with it in the corner, where the morning light came through the high window, and she would read every page of it. She was done waiting for someone to tell her who she was. She was going to find out herself. And when she knew, when she had all of it, every piece, every truth her mother had sealed away in silence, she was going to decide what to do with it. Not Vera, not the king, not any alpha who had ever looked at her and seen nothing. Her. The palace breathed around her, stone and iron and old wood settling in the cold, and in the rooms 2 corridors away and a floor above, Corin went to sleep thinking about a young woman who said thank you like she meant it. And somewhere below the east courtyard, a man stood in the dark for a moment longer than made sense, before turning and walking away. And somewhere in the walls between these things, the old thing moved again, pressing against the surface of Seraphine's skin, patient and warm, and impossibly old, knowing, the way only very old things know, that the time was almost here. The book was thinner than she expected, but denser than almost anything she had read before. The language was old. Not so old as to be incomprehensible, but old enough that some of the words sat strangely, as if they had meant something slightly different once, and had not fully caught up to the present. She read slowly, which was not how she usually read, because she did not want to miss something in the effort to reach the next page. The first section was historical. It described a lineage, not a pack lineage, not the kind that traced territory and alpha succession, but a bloodline that preceded packs entirely. Before territories were drawn and alphas named and tribute systems established, there had been something older. The text called them the first line. It said that the first line did not have wolf halves in the way that all wolves born since them did. It said that the first line was the source from which wolf nature had originally spread, that what lived in the blood of every wolf in every pack was a diluted echo of what the first line carried at full strength. It said that the first line's blood ran silver. Seraphine sat very still and read that sentence twice. The second section was where the word suppression appeared in context, and it was harder to read, not because of the language but because of what it described. The first line had been nearly wiped out during a period the text called the First Alpha Wars. The alphas who rose to power in the aftermath had understood, correctly, as it turned out, that even one living member of the first line was a challenge to the authority of every alpha alive, because the first line did not submit, not to rank, not to dominance displays, not to the power structures the new alphas had built. Their blood simply did not carry the capacity for that kind of submission, and no alpha command could reach past it. And so they had been killed, systematically and thoroughly, over several decades, until the general understanding became that none remained. The third section was shorter, and had clearly been added later, by a different hand. It described a ritual, a blood suppression ritual, designed, the text said carefully, the word designed doing a lot of work in that sentence, to hide a first-line child until they were old enough to protect themselves. The ritual dampened the silver quality of the blood, reduced it to an undetectable level, and could be maintained indefinitely if renewed. It required the child's mother to perform it. It required the mother to keep the secret entirely alone. It could be broken by intense emotion, by physical injury that drew blood unexpectedly. Or, and this part was written in a different ink, as if added as an afterthought, by proximity to sufficient concentration of alpha power, the kind of power that existed only in one place. Seraphine looked up from the book. She was sitting in the reading room of the Iron Throne's royal palace. in the wing that sat closest to the center of the most powerful alpha territory in the known world. She had been hidden her entire life. Her mother had hidden her. And the hiding had begun to fail the moment she arrived here. She pressed the book flat against the table with both hands and breathed through the understanding of it, which was large and sharp and full of her mother's face. Elena had known what she was. Elena had sealed it away to keep her alive and had taken the knowledge to her grave, leaving Seraphine 21 years of being called a hollow, 21 years of believing she was less than everyone around her, to protect her from people who would have destroyed her if they knew the truth. Seraphine sat with that for a long time. She was not sure, even now, whether she was more grateful or more wrecked by it. When Corin came to bring her back, he found her with the book face down on the table, and her hands folded in her lap, and her face completely composed. "Are you all right?" he asked, which surprised her. She would not have expected him to notice. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She left the book where it was. She did not need to take it. She had read it completely, and she remembered everything she had ever read. It was the one advantage her odd, wolfless, hollow life had given her. She had always had nothing to do but read, and her memory had sharpened around that the way a blade sharpens against stone. Back in her rooms, she stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard she still could not quite see into, and thought about what came next. She knew what she was. The book had given her that, and the fact of it was still landing in her piece by piece, each piece heavier than the last. But knowing was not the same as having options. She was still in this room, still under observation, and Vera still had 2 vials of her blood in that leather case. She needed to know what he intended to do with them, and she needed to know whose footsteps had been stopping outside her door. The answer to the first question required access to Vera, or to someone who knew his work. The answer to the second question was something she was increasingly certain she already knew. She just needed to be sure. She did not have long to wait. The following evening, at the exact hour when the corridor was quietest, her door opened. Not by a guard, not by Corin. And Calum Draskin walked into her room for the first time, and the quality of the air changed the way it does when something that has always been inevitable finally arrives. He was not what she had expected. She had expected something deliberately frightening, the practiced presentation of someone who had held power long enough to weaponize their appearance. What she got was a man who moved, like someone who had never needed to perform anything, because the reality had always been enough. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, and he wore no ceremonial anything, just dark clothes, practical, and an expression that had been composed a very long time ago, and showed no signs of softening. He looked at her, the way she imagined he looked at everything, completely, and without flinching. "You have been reading," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. "What did you find?" She looked at him steadily. "I found out who I am," she said. "Did you already know?" A pause. Not long, but real. "Vera has a theory," he said. "I imagine he does," she said. "I also imagine his theory involves those 2 vials of blood in his leather case, being far more useful to him than I am as a person." The king said nothing, but something moved behind his eyes, something she could not name yet, though she noted its existence, and filed it away. "You are not afraid," he said. "I am many things," she said. "Fear is somewhere in the list, but it is not at the top." He looked at her for another moment, that complete, unblinking attention, and then he said, "You should be more careful about what you say in this palace." "I know," she said, "but I have found that people who tell you to be careful are usually more concerned about what you might say than about your actual safety." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was not uncomfortable either. It was the particular silence of 2 people who have both understood something at the same time, and are each waiting to see what the other will do with the understanding. He left without saying anything more. She sat down on the edge of the bed and let out a long, slow breath. That had gone either very well or very badly, and she would not know which for some time. But she had looked at the Alpha King of the Iron Throne, and she had not lowered her eyes, and she had not changed a word of what she said, and whatever came next, she had not given him anything he could use against her. It was, she decided, a beginning. 3 days after Calum walked out of her room, Vera came back with his case. This time there were more vials. Seraphine counted them as he set the case on the table. 14. He had brought enough to fill 14. She looked at the case, and then at him, and said, very calmly, "No." He stopped. He had been in the middle of opening the first latch. He looked up at her, with an expression that had never expected to hear that word from her. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "No," she said again. "Not today. Not like this. The assessment is ongoing," she said. "I understand. And I have cooperated. But you have not told me what you are doing with my blood, who else has access to it, or what you intend to do with whatever conclusions you are reaching. I would like to know those things before I give you 14 more vials." He studied her. "You are not in a position to make conditions." "I know," she said, "but I have also been here long enough to notice that you have not told the king what you found. Not fully. You told him I was an unusual case. You did not use the word moonblood in his presence. I know this because he said Vera has a theory, not Vera told me what you are. Those are different sentences." The room went very still. Vera set down the case. He straightened. The expression on his face had done something she had not seen it do before. It had become careful. Not the casual professional care he usually wore. Careful the way a person is careful when they realize they are in a negotiation they had not prepared for. It was the same thing the king had said. "I have been reading," she confirmed. "The book in the reading room," he said. "Among other things." He pulled a chair from the corner, turned it, and sat down. This surprised her. It was the first time he had sat in her presence. He folded his hands in his lap with the controlled grace of a man who made all his physical habits deliberate, and he looked at her with something that, if it had been warmer, she might have called respect. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to know what you are planning to do with me," she said. Not the official answer, the real one. A pause. "That depends on what you are." "I know what I am," she said. "Then you understand that what you are makes you the most significant discovery in the history of the known packs," he said. "You also understand that there are people, many people, in many places, who would consider your existence a threat significant enough to justify ending it." "I understand that," she said, "which is why I want to know whose side you are on." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am on the side of knowledge," he said finally. "I have spent my life studying what wolves are, and where they came from. You are the answer to questions I have been asking for 30 years. I have no interest in ending you. I have a very strong interest in understanding you." "And the king?" she asked. Vera's hands moved slightly. A small adjustment of his folded fingers. "The king is complicated," he said. "He is," she agreed. "But he is also the person who moved me to his wing before you told him everything. Which suggests he made a decision about my safety before he had full information to justify it. That is not the behavior of a man who is planning to have me removed." Vera looked at her with an expression she would only understand later as the beginning of his fear of her. Not fear of her power. He was not yet fully certain of that. Fear of her mind. "What do you propose?" he asked. "I will cooperate with your assessment," she said. "Fully, without resistance, for as long as it is genuinely needed. In exchange, you will tell me everything you know and everything you discover. No filtered version, no managed information, all of it. And the king? That is a separate conversation," she said. Vera considered it. She watched him consider it, watched the calculation move through him, and she knew, before he answered, what the answer would be. He was a man who valued knowledge above nearly everything else. She was offering him access to the most significant subject he would ever study, on terms that cost him only honesty. "Agreed," he said. He opened the case, and they began. The sessions with Vera over the following 2 weeks were the strangest experience of Seraphine's life, and she had lived a strange life. He was methodical in the way of someone who had made methodology a form of devotion. He tested her blood at different times of day, under different conditions, resting, walking, after cold water on her face, after she had read for an hour, after she had gone without food since the previous evening. He documented everything in a small, dense script that covered page after page of a leather notebook. And, as agreed, he told her what he found. The silver quality of her blood was not constant. It was lowest in the early morning, and highest in the late evening. It intensified when she was very still and focused, and it retreated when she was distracted or tired. It responded to emotional state, not dramatically, but measurably, the silver content shifting upward when she felt something strongly, and pulling back when she suppressed it. It is not just blood, he told her, near the end of the first week. The silver is a property of something in your cellular structure that has no equivalent in standard wolf biology. It is, as far as I can determine, a form of active energy. It is alive in a way that blood is not usually alive. She turned that over. What does it do? We do not fully know yet. What we know is what the ancient texts describe, that the first line could affect the wolf nature in others. Not control it, not dominate it the way an alpha does through rank and power. Something more fundamental, like, he paused, searching for the right word, like the difference between shouting at a river to change its course and touching the source of the river. Seraphine sat with that. Show me what happens, Vera said one afternoon, near the end of the second week, when you let it out. She looked at him. I have not done that intentionally. Try, he said. She looked at her hands. She thought about the night in the courtyard of Iron Moon, when the elder wolf had looked at her at the spring gathering and said, loudly enough for people to hear, that sending her as tribute was the kindest thing the pack could do, because at least this way, she would be someone else's problem. She thought about her stepmother's face when the chain was locked. She thought about 21 years of absence, of being told she had nothing, of the word hollow spoken like a door slamming. The light in the room changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the quality of the air, like the moment before a storm when everything goes slightly more defined. Then it became less subtle. Her hands were illuminated from beneath the skin, silver light pressing outward through her palms, spreading up her forearms. The vials on Vera's table rang against each other, as if the room itself had taken a breath. Then she pulled it back. The light disappeared. The vials steadied. She looked up at Vera. His notebook was on the floor. He had dropped it. He stared at her, with his mouth slightly open, which she suspected was an expression he rarely wore, and his pale eyes were very bright. How did you do that? He asked. I thought about something true, she said. He picked up his notebook with hands that were not quite steady. He said nothing for a long moment, writing rapidly. Then, does it feel like power? She thought about the question honestly. It feels like weight leaving, she said, like putting something down that I have been carrying for a long time. He wrote that down too. The problem with making an agreement with Vera was that Seraphine had assumed she was the most interested party in the arrangement. She had underestimated how much of his attention she would actually occupy. He came every morning and every afternoon. He sent Corin with additional questions written on small pieces of paper between visits. He left books outside her door, not from the reading room, but from his private collection, marked with small strips of paper where he wanted her to pay particular attention. She read everything. She answered everything. And through it, she built a picture. She was not simply a rare bloodline. She was the bloodline. The texts Vera shared with her, the ones he had been collecting for 30 years, from libraries and pack territories she had never visited, from historians who no longer existed, described the first line as the origin point of the entire wolf world, not metaphorically, literally. Every wolf, in every pack, in every territory, carried a fraction of what she carried in full. The implication of that was something she sat with for several nights before she let herself think it through completely. If all wolves were descended from the first line, then the first line was not subject to alpha authority in the way that other wolves were, because alpha authority was itself a derivative thing. The king could command every wolf in his domain. He could not command the thing that all wolves had come from. His wolf had knelt to hers before he ever walked into her room. She had not understood that when it happened. She understood it now. On the 15th day of the assessment, Vera came in the morning and did not open his case. He sat across from her with his hands on his knees and his notebook closed beside him, and said, "The king wants to speak with you, formally, in his study." She had been expecting this. "When?" she asked. "This afternoon," he said. "There are things I need to tell you first." She looked at him. His face had the carefully composed quality of a man who was about to say something he had been organizing for a while. "He knows what you are," Vera said. "I told him 2 days ago. Not because I wanted to. I wanted more time. But because he asked me directly, and I could not effectively lie to him." "What was his response?" she asked. Vera paused. "He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me if you were aware of what you were." What did you tell him? I told him you had figured most of it out yourself, Vera said, with something in his voice that she thought might have been, in someone else, a form of pride. He was quiet again. Then he said to arrange the meeting. She nodded slowly. Seraphine, Vera said, and it was the first time he had used her name, just her name, without any title or qualifier. He is not a simple man. He has built something very large on a foundation of absolute authority, and what you are challenges every part of that foundation. I would not assume that his curiosity makes him safe. She looked at Vera. I do not assume anyone is safe, she said, but I have been in his palace for more than 2 weeks, and I am still here. That is a data point. It is, he said. And he moved me to his wing before he knew what I was, she said. That is also a data point. Vera looked at her with that expression she had started to recognize, the beginning of something that had no category in his neat, organized mind. Yes, he said quietly, it is. She went to the meeting that afternoon, with her hair braided back, in the plain, well-made clothes they had given her, with nothing in her hands, and nothing on her face but attention. The king's study was full of maps. They covered every wall, some framed and some unframed, some drawn on paper so old it had gone yellow at the edges, some drawn on material she did not recognize. They overlapped in places, territories bleeding into each other, and she could see at a glance that some of them were decades apart in age, showing the same land under different borders. The room smelled of ink and old parchment, and something sharper underneath. Calum was standing at the far wall with his back to her when she came in. He did not turn immediately. She did not announce herself. She had not been told to. She walked in, looked at the maps, and waited. When he turned, he was carrying a cup of something hot, which he set on the desk without offering her any. The desk was large and buried under papers, which struck her as the most humanizing thing she had seen about him yet. The most powerful alpha in the world had a messy desk. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched long enough to have a shape. Vera tells me you found the book yourself, he said. Yes, she said. Before or after you understood what the blood meant? I understood what the blood meant when I found the book, she said. Before that I had facts without a frame. He considered that. And now? Now I have both, she said. He set his cup down on the desk and moved around to the front of it, leaning against it with his arms folded, and looked at her with that full, unblinking attention that she was beginning to understand was not aggression, though it looked like aggression. It was the attention of someone who had spent years in a world where information was power, and had therefore trained himself to collect it constantly. What do you want? He asked. It was the same question Vera had asked her, but it landed differently from this man's mouth. Coming from Vera, it had been practical. Coming from Calum, it was something else. Something she was not yet ready to name. I want to understand what happened to my family, she said. I want to know what my mother knew, and how she knew it, and who else knew it. I want to understand what I am, and after that, she stopped. After that, he said. After that, I will decide what I want to do about it, she said. I am not planning to decide that today, or this week, or based on what anyone in this room tells me to want. A silence. Then something happened that she had not seen before. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. She did not think he was a man who smiled easily, but a shift, like a feature of his expression that had been very tight for a very long time, had just eased by 1 degree. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right? All right, he said again, simply. She waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. He pushed off the desk and moved back around it, sat down, and began looking at the papers in front of him as if the conversation had arrived at its natural end. She stood in the middle of the study, between the old maps and the messy desk and the man behind it, and she thought, this is not what I planned for. She had planned for resistance, for politics, for the careful management of a man who would see her as a threat to everything he had built and would respond accordingly. She had prepared responses to arguments he had not made, and counterpoints to positions he had not taken. He had just said all right, and gone back to his papers. I will need access to older records, she said. Historical documents from before the first Alpha Wars. Vera thinks some of them are in the lower archive. Corin will arrange it, Calum said, without looking up. I may need. Whatever you need, tell Corin. he said. He will see to it. She looked at the top of his head, bent over the papers. Why? She asked. He did look up then. Why what? Why are you cooperating? She said. I am what I am. You know what I am. The entire structure of your authority, every pack, every alpha, every tribute system, and territorial boundary, is built on the assumption that I do not exist. I am a problem for you, so why are you cooperating? He held her gaze. Something in his eyes had gone very still. Because, he said, after a pause that was long enough to be honest, you walked in here with nothing, and you have not once behaved like someone who has nothing. And I have been surrounded my entire life by people who knew exactly how to behave in every situation. You do not behave, you simply are. And I find that, he stopped. She waited. I find that I am not ready to stop paying attention to it, he said. She stood very still for a moment. Then she nodded, once. I will tell Corin about the archives, she said. She left the study without looking back. In the corridor outside, she stood against the cold stone wall and let out a breath she had been holding since she entered the room. He was not what she had planned for. He was not, she was beginning to understand, something she had any reliable plan for at all. That was either a problem or an opportunity. She was going to have to think carefully about which one. The archives were 3 levels below the main floor of the palace. They were cold and dry and smelled of something she had no name for, the specific smell of information that had been contained in one place for a very long time. She went down with Corin the next morning and stood in the entrance corridor, looking at rows of shelving that disappeared into a darkness her eyes adjusted to slowly. It would take weeks to go through everything. She got to work. The archives gave her a week of uninterrupted reading before the first attempt on her life. She had been going down every morning with Corin and spending 4 to 5 hours in the cold rows of documents, building a picture of the first Alpha Wars from primary sources she had never had access to before. The picture was not flattering to the current pack system. The wars had not been defensive, as the histories she had read in Iron Moon described them. They had been aggressive and targeted, a series of coordinated campaigns against a people who had not wanted territory or titles, and had only been dangerous because their existence made every territorial claim fragile. The first line could not be made to submit. That was the simplest and most complete description. They did not do it through defiance. They simply did not carry the mechanism for it. The Alpha command that worked on every wolf from a distance, that dropped betas to their knees and made omegas flinch across a room, simply passed through the first line without catching. It was like giving an order to water, which meant any wolf in proximity to a first-line member would feel the disconnect. Their own submission response would not fire, and in the absence of that response, the Alpha's authority became a performance with no audience. Seraphine read this and understood, fully for the first time, why they had been so thoroughly hunted. She also found something Vera had not mentioned, which she suspected meant he had not found it yet. A footnote in a document so old its edges had gone to powder. It described the first line's blood not only as silver, but as responsive, that the blood did not simply exist in its carrier, but actively interacted with the world. Under sufficient control, a member of the first line could extend the silver property outward, not spread it to others. It could not be given, but extend its field, enough to disrupt the Alpha command structure for any wolf within its reach. Every wolf within its reach. She sat with that for a long time, in the cold and the dark between the shelves, with an old document in her careful hands. She was still sitting with it when she heard the footsteps that were not Corin's. Corin's footsteps were even and unhurried. He had learned in the first 2 days that she worked best without interruption, and had adjusted to waiting near the entrance, and coming in, only to tell her when the time was up. These footsteps were coming from the wrong direction. They were coming from the back of the archive, from the deep part she had not yet reached, and they were careful in the way that meant they were trying not to be heard. She set the document down very gently. She did not stand. She slid off the stool she had been sitting on and moved into the shadow between 2 shelves, pressing her back against the cold stone. A man came around the corner. He was dressed in the gray of the palace service staff, which told her nothing because she had noticed early that the gray of service staff was an easy uniform to acquire. He was carrying something in his right hand, a small ceramic flask with a stopper. He was looking at the stool she had just vacated, and when he saw it was empty, he stopped. He looked around. She was very still. He looked directly at the space between the shelves where she was standing, and then his eyes moved on, which told her that her instinct to press back into the dark had been the right one. He moved to the table, looked at the documents she had been reading, and began to pour something from the flask onto the table surface. Not much, just enough to coat the area where her hands had been resting. She watched him replace the stopper with the careful hands of someone who did not want to touch the outside of the flask, and she understood, in the way you understand something when all the details line up at once, that whatever was in the flask was meant for skin contact, meant for her. He straightened, turned, and she stepped out of the shadow. She did not know, afterward, exactly what had happened in her face when she did it, but whatever it was, it stopped him completely. He stood frozen in the narrow corridor between the shelves, and she saw the flask in his hand, and the set of his shoulders, and the expression of a man who had been caught, and knew it, and had not planned for it. "Who sent you?" she said. He ran. He was fast, faster than she expected, which meant he was a wolf. He went around the corner and toward the back of the archive, deeper rather than toward the entrance, which meant he knew another way out. She did not chase him. She could not outrun a shifted wolf, and she had no interest in following someone into a part of the archive she did not yet know in the dark. She went to the table instead, and looked at the liquid he had poured without touching it. It was colorless and faintly oily. She picked up a loose piece of paper from the discard pile near the table, and used it to soak up a small amount, which she folded carefully and tucked inside her jacket. Then she went to get Corin. Corin's response to her telling him what had happened was immediate and sharp. He sent her to the wall, positioned himself between her and the archive entrance, and had a group of guards arriving in the space of 2 minutes. She watched this happen, with the part of her mind that catalogued things, and noted that Corin's calm efficiency under pressure was not the performance of someone newly trained. He had been placed here by someone who trusted his ability to handle a situation. The king, she thought. Not Vera, who thought in medical terms. The king, who thought in protection terms. Vera identified the substance from the paper sample she gave him that afternoon. It was a compound used historically. He said the word historically in a way that meant recently enough to be alarming, to disrupt silver-carrying blood. It was not lethal to an ordinary wolf. In a carrier of moon blood, at high enough concentration, it would have permanently suppressed the silver property, sealed it away, the way the ritual had sealed it, but without reversal. It would have made her, effectively, a hollow again, for the rest of her life. She sat in her rooms that evening and thought about that, about whoever had sent the man into the archive, about what it meant that someone in this palace knew enough about her blood's properties to target them specifically. It was not random. It was not a general threat against her life. It was a targeted attempt to take away exactly what she was. Someone who understood moonblood well enough to act against it specifically had decided she was dangerous enough to neutralize, not kill, neutralize, which meant they wanted her present but diminished, and that meant they wanted to be able to use her somehow once she was reduced. The king came to her rooms that evening without announcement. He did not say anything when he came in, which she had started to understand was his way. He walked to the window she always kept open and stood looking out at the courtyard, and she watched him from the chair where she was sitting. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "The man has not been found," he said. "The back passage of the archive connects to 3 different exits. He had help." "I know," she said. A pause. "Do you know who sent him?" "No," she said, "but whoever it was had specific knowledge of what my blood does and how to suppress it. That is not common knowledge. The number of people with that information is small." He turned from the window. His face was doing something controlled, the jaw set, the expression compressed, and she recognized it now. It was what he looked like when he was managing an anger he had decided not to act on yet. "Vera knows," he said. "Vera is on my side," she said. His eyes came to her. "How certain are you of that?" "Certain enough," she said. "He wants to understand me. Suppressing me eliminates the subject of his study. His self-interest is aligned with my well-being. That is a cold basis for trust," Calum said. "It is a reliable one," she said. He was quiet. She watched him move from the window to the desk in the corner of the room, where he stood with his hands on the surface, looking at the table without seeing it. "You will not be going back to the archive," he said. "That is not your decision." she said. I am. I know what you are, she said quietly. And I understand that in this palace, what you say is what happens. But I need those documents. Without them, I am working with half the picture. Someone just tried to reduce me to a state where I cannot defend myself. And the best defense I have is understanding what I am. She looked at him steadily. I will go back with better security, but I will go back. The silence was long enough that she thought he might simply say no and end the conversation. He was the Alpha King. He could. Instead he said, 6 guards, 2 with you at all times in the archive. Different entry and exit times each day. He looked up. Non-negotiable. She considered it. Agreed, she said. He nodded once. He moved toward the door. Calum, she said. He stopped. She was not sure why she had used his name. She had not planned to. He turned. Thank you, she said, for coming to check. Another of those almost movements at the corner of his mouth. Gone before it was fully there. Go to sleep, he said. You have been reading in the dark for a week, and you look like it. He left. She sat in the chair for a while longer, and then, eventually, went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about the attempt on her blood, about who had the knowledge and the motive to send someone into that archive, with exactly that compound, in exactly that flask. She thought about what it meant that they had not wanted her dead. She thought about Vera's face when he identified the compound, which had gone very still in a way she recognized as controlled alarm. She thought about a line in one of the archive documents she had read before the interruption, a line she had nearly passed over because its phrasing was dense. It said that in the period before the first Alpha Wars began, there had been members of the first line living openly among the packs, not as rulers, not as alphas, but as something the text called anchors, people whose presence stabilized the wolf nature in everyone around them, reduced conflict, calmed aggression that had no good object. Anchors. She pressed the word against the inside of her mind. She thought about how it felt when she had let the silver out in Vera's session. Not power going outward, but weight leaving. The difference was important. She was not imposing anything. She was simply being, fully, what she was, and that fullness had an effect on the world around it. Someone in this palace understood that. Someone who was not Vera, not Corin, not the king, had understood it well enough to want it gone. She needed to find out who it was before they tried again. Because the next attempt, she suspected, would not be as gentle. The second attempt came 5 days later, and it had nothing to do with the archive. She was walking back from the reading room, alone for 3 minutes, which was the gap between Corin's rotation and the replacement guard's arrival, a gap that someone had clearly mapped and planned around, when the corridor went dark. Not the darkness of a light going out, but an active darkness, a darkness with weight and intention, the kind produced by a seer working a sight suppression field. Seraphine stopped. She did not run. Running when you cannot see where you are going in a palace with stone floors and sudden turns was not a survival strategy. She stood still, and she breathed. The darkness pressed in from 3 sides. She could hear footsteps, 2 sets, coming from ahead and to her left. She could hear the low, focused breathing of the seer somewhere behind her, maintaining the field. She had read about sight suppression fields in the archive. They worked by disrupting the visual perception of anyone caught inside them. They did not affect other senses, and they required the seer to remain completely stationary to maintain the field, because any movement broke concentration. She turned around. She could not see the seer, but she could hear the breathing, steady, controlled, positioned approximately 8 steps behind her, and 2 steps to the right. She walked toward the sound. The breathing caught, a small intake, not loud, but she heard it, and then the field fractured. Light came back in fragments, then all at once, and she blinked in it, and saw the seer, a young woman in plain clothes, against the wall, who looked at Seraphine with wide eyes, and then bolted. The 2 people who had been coming from ahead and the left had already turned and were running. One of them was wearing the same gray service uniform as the man in the archive. The same person was organizing these attempts. Multiple methods, multiple people, coordinated timing. When Corin arrived 40 seconds later, slightly out of breath, she was standing in the middle of the corridor, completely unharmed. He looked at her, at the empty corridor, at her again. There was a site suppression field, she said. And 3 people. They ran when the field broke. He closed his eyes briefly. I should not have left you. No, she agreed. But I am fine. What I need now is for you to get me a meeting with the king tonight. Not tomorrow morning. Tonight. Corin nodded without arguing, which she appreciated. The meeting happened in the same map-covered study as the first time, but the energy in the room was different. Calum was standing when she came in, and he was not wearing the composed, controlled expression she was used to. He was wearing something else, something that did not have the usual professional distance. He looked at her when she walked in, the way you look at something you are relieved to see, and then he arranged his face, and the moment passed, but she had seen it. She filed it away and said, 2 attempts in 5 days. The same person is organizing both. They have access to seer contacts and to the gray staff uniform, which means either they are high enough in the palace structure to move resources freely, or they have someone in that position working with them. He had already been briefed by Corin. She could tell. He was not processing the information for the first time. He was listening to what she made of it. What do you need? He asked. I need access to the record of everyone in the palace who has requested resources from the Seer's registry in the past 30 days, she said. I also need the complete list of people who have read the bloodline files in your historical record room before my arrival. Not everyone who has access, everyone who has actually used that access. He looked at her for a moment. You have already identified someone, he said. She had. She was not ready to say it yet, because she was not certain, and certainty mattered. I have a direction, she said. The records will confirm or redirect it. I will have them for you by morning, he said. She nodded. She turned to go. Seraphine. She stopped. Turned. He was looking at her with an expression she did not quite have a word for, something that was not the careful professional attention she had catalogued, and the not yet named thing she had seen at the corner of his mouth, and not entirely the relief she had caught when she walked in. It was something layered, something with history in it that she did not yet know. I want you to have a personal guard, he said. Not a rotation. One person, consistent, specifically assigned to you. She considered it. Her first instinct was to say she did not need it. Her second instinct, sharper and more honest, recognized that her first instinct was pride, not strategy. Who? She asked. I will choose someone I trust, he said. She nodded. Walking back to her rooms, she thought about the expression on his face. She turned it over the way she turned things over in her mind, methodically, looking at it from different angles, testing it against what she knew. He had not wanted to feel what he felt when she walked in. She had seen the effort it took to rearrange his face. That was not the behavior of a man who saw her as an asset, or a problem, or a case to be managed. That was the behavior of a man who was losing a fight with himself. She was not entirely certain how she felt about that. She was also not entirely certain that uncertain was the same as unwilling. She went back to her rooms, and found the records had already been started. Calum had apparently sent the order before she left the study. Corin brought them just before the night hour, 2 thick folders, that she took to the table and opened by lamplight. The first name she found in the historical bloodline file record, 3 months before her arrival, in handwriting she recognized from the leather notebooks she had seen every day for 2 weeks. Vera. She sat with that for a moment. Then she kept reading. The second name, 2 months before her arrival, accessing the same documents, was not a name she recognized at all. She wrote it down. She would give it to the king in the morning. She was almost certain she had found who was trying to erase her. She was also almost certain it was only the visible edge of something much larger, and that the person she had found was not the person ultimately giving the instructions. Somewhere above the man in the gray uniform and the young seer in the corridor, someone with real power had decided that Seraphine Ashwood could not be allowed to become fully what she was. She was going to need to become it anyway. Fast. The name she had written down was Aldrich Moon. She found him the next morning, in the record of palace staff. He was listed as a senior advisor in the court's historical studies division, which was a department she had not known existed, and which apparently employed 4 people, whose job was to maintain and cross-reference the palace's oldest documents. It was the perfect position, quiet, adjacent to the archive, not prominent enough to draw attention, with exactly the access needed to know what was in the files and who was reading them. She gave the name to Calum, at the morning meeting he had begun establishing as part of the new security arrangement. He looked at it for a moment. His expression did not change, but something around his eyes tightened slightly. "You know him," she said. "I know who he is," Calum said. "He has been in this palace for 11 years. He set the paper on his desk. I will have him located and detained." "Before you do," she said, "I would like to know who he reports to." Calum looked up. "He accessed the bloodline files 2 months before I arrived," she said. "That means someone knew enough to send him to look, specifically at that material, before I even knew what I was. Which means either Aldrich Moon is very individually perceptive and has been independently studying Moonblood for years, possible but unlikely, or someone directed him to it, someone who had a reason to be looking." Calum was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, which was different from watching most people think. It was not visible. His face did not move through the process, but there was something in the quality of his stillness that changed when he was calculating, a slight deepening, like a house when all the windows are shut. "I will have him watched rather than detained," he said. "See who he contacts." "That was going to be my suggestion," she said. He glanced at her sideways, one of those brief, unguarded looks that she had started cataloging, because they were the most honest things his face did. "Is it?" he said. "I am used to being observed," she said. "I know how it works." The personal guard Calum had promised arrived that afternoon. His name was Fenwick, and he was not young. Mid-40s, Seraphine estimated, with the particular stillness of someone who had been in enough situations to have stopped being surprised by them. He did not make conversation when he was on duty. He positioned himself efficiently and moved with her, without crowding her, which she appreciated. He was, she could tell in the first hour, very good at what he did. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked him, the first evening. 17 years, he said. "For the king?" "For 11 of them," he said. She nodded. She did not ask more, but she noted that Calum had not sent her a guard. He had sent her a guard he trusted personally, which meant one who had been with him long enough to be loyal to him specifically, rather than to the position. It was the same logic as Corin. The people he placed around her were people he had built relationships with, people he knew. She did not examine too carefully what that implied. In the reading room that same afternoon, she found the letter. She had not been looking for a letter. She had been going through a secondary stack of documents Corin had pulled from the lower archive, looking for anything that predated the first Alpha Wars, and dealt with the practical nature of Moonblood, what it could do, what constrained it, how it had been used in the original world before the hunts. The letter was tucked between 2 large sheets of land survey, folded 4 times into a compact square, written on paper that had gone soft with age. She almost set it aside. Then she unfolded it. It was addressed to a woman named Lyra. No family name, just Lyra, in handwriting that she did not recognize for 4 lines, and then recognized all at once, with a force that made her sit very still, in the way that recognition of something very important always made her go still. The handwriting was her mother's. She read it twice before she moved. Then she read it a 3rd time, slowly, making sure of every word. The letter was not dated. It had been written by Elena Ashwood. Her name was signed at the bottom, full and clear, to someone named Lyra, who the letter addressed as old friend, which told her the friendship was long-standing. The letter described a plan. Elena was going to use the suppression ritual. She was going to hide her daughter. She was asking Lyra to place this letter somewhere it would eventually be found, specifically in the Iron Throne's archive, specifically in the section on first-line history, because Elena believed, the letter said this plainly, that if her daughter ever came to the Iron Throne, it would mean the suppression had begun to fail, and if it had begun to fail near the court, there was a reason. There was something in the proximity to that level of alpha power that would eventually strip away what she had sealed. The letter went on to say things she read carefully, sentence by sentence, her hands very steady on the soft paper. Elena had not come from Iron Moon originally. Iron Moon was where she had hidden, the way people hide in plain sight, in a community so ordinary and unglamorous that no one with serious intent would think to look there. Elena had come from a place called the Silver Shore, which Seraphine had never heard of, but which the letter described as the last community of first-line descendants to live openly, before they were found and scattered in the final years of the hunts, roughly 40 years before Seraphine's birth. Elena had been the last child born at the Silver Shore. She had been carried out by Lyra, who was not first line herself, but had been raised in the community. She had grown up in hiding, learned to pass as a standard wolf, and then, the letter became careful here, choosing words with precision. She had met someone. The letter did not name Seraphine's father. It said simply, he was first line also, the only other one she had ever met who survived the scattering. Their daughter, the letter said, would not carry half the lineage. She would carry the full convergence of 2 surviving lines. Whatever had been diluted and scattered would reconverge in this one child. Elena's last line, before the signature, read, "If she has found her way to the throne, she is stronger than I knew how to protect her from being. Let the palace be the place she learns what she carries. It was always meant to be found. I am sorry I could not be the one to tell her." Seraphine sat in the reading room for a very long time. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of anyone since she was 9 years old, and had made a decision about that which had held ever since. But she sat with the letter in her lap, and looked at the light coming through the high window, and felt the weight of what she was holding. Her mother had known, had planned for this, had placed a letter where it would be found, if the plan worked, and if Seraphine ended up exactly where she was. Elena had not left her with nothing. She had left her with a destination she had not told her about, because telling her would have required explaining everything else, and explaining everything else would have made the hiding impossible. Seraphine had spent her whole life believing her mother left her with nothing. Elena had left her with everything she had. She had just packed it in a way that required her daughter to be brave enough to find it. When Corin came to tell her the time was up, she folded the letter carefully and put it inside her jacket, against her chest. "Are you all right?" he asked. He asked her this often now. She thought he probably asked everyone he worked with this question regularly, and she thought that was one of the more quietly valuable things about him. "Not entirely," she said honestly, "but I will be." She asked Vera that evening about the Silver Shore. His reaction told her everything. He went very still, his pen stopping mid-stroke, and then he looked up at her, with an expression that stripped the professional distance away entirely for a moment. Pure, unguarded response. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked. "My mother's letter," she said, "which I found in the archive today." "A letter," he said softly. He set the pen down. "Elena Ashwood came from the Silver Shore." "You knew?" she asked. "I suspected," he said. "I have been studying first-line history for 30 years. The Silver Shore was the last documented community. I knew the approximate timeline of its fall. When your file came to me, when I saw the age and the pack of origin and the suppression signature in your blood, I suspected, but I had no confirmation." "My father was also first line," she said. The stillness that moved over his face was not his calculated control. It was genuine. "Both lines," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of its clinical precision, something more complicated underneath. "Seraphine, when 2 first-line individuals produced offspring, it was documented, in the oldest texts, before the hunts. The convergence did not simply add the lineages together. It multiplied them. The suppression ritual your mother used would have contained that at birth, but it could not have contained it indefinitely, not near this much concentrated alpha power." He looked at her. "Do you understand what I am saying? The suppression was not just hiding me," she said. "It was keeping the convergence from accelerating on its own." "Yes," he said. "Now that it is failing, now that you are here, near the court, with the field weakening, it will not fail slowly. When it goes, it will go entirely. And what comes after that will be—" He stopped. "Will be what?" "The," she said. The answer to a question everyone stopped asking, because they thought it was theoretical, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Vera," she said carefully, "you need to tell me who else you have discussed my case with." He met her eyes. "No one," he said. "As agreed." "Then how did Aldrich Moon know to look at the first-line bloodline files 2 months before I arrived?" she said. The silence that followed was very long. "I do not know," Vera said. "And that concerns me more than it concerns you." It concerned her considerably. "Can you think of any way someone could have anticipated my arrival? Any leak in your research? Any communication that was intercepted? Anyone who might have seen your notes over the years?" He thought for a moment. She watched him think carefully. Then something moved through his expression. Quick, uncomfortable, gone almost immediately. "What?" she said. "Many years ago," he said slowly, "I wrote a theoretical paper on the possibility that a surviving convergence might be discovered. I did not publish it. I showed it to one person, for feedback." She waited. "A man named Edric Holt," he said. "He was a colleague at the time. He left palace service approximately 3 years ago." He paused. "He now advises the Council of the Greymount Pack." Seraphine thought about the name. She thought about Aldrich Moon and his contact in the archive. She thought about attempts designed not to kill but to suppress. "Greymount," she said. "Who is the Alpha of Greymount?" "A man named Cason Ward," Vera said. "He is one of the 6-pack Alphas who sit on the Interterritorial Council. He is," Vera chose his next words with great care, "he is someone who has spent 20 years building coalitions among the other Alphas. Someone who would understand very precisely what a convergence meant for the authority of every Alpha in the known world." The picture was becoming complete. It was not a comfortable picture. She stood. "I need to speak to the king tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." Vera nodded. For the first time since she had known him, he did not ask any questions. He simply reached for the cord that called for a messenger. Seraphine stood in the middle of the room with her mother's letter still pressed against her chest and felt the thing beneath her skin pressing back, stronger than it had pressed in weeks, as if it too had been listening, as if it knew that the time for patience was ending. She pressed her hand flat over her heart, and it pulsed once against her palm, silver and warm and impossibly old. She pressed back. "Not yet," she told it silently. "Soon." The king's study was lit by 2 oil lamps when she arrived, which gave the room a different quality than the morning meetings. The maps looked different in lamplight, the borders less fixed, the territories breathing slightly, the ancient land alive in a way that flat daylight flattened. Calum was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and she noticed, with the attention she gave to everything about him, that he had not been reading. He had been sitting, which meant he had been waiting, which meant he had already guessed from the urgency of the summons that this was not a routine update. She told him everything. She gave him her mother's letter to read, which she had not planned to do, and which she did, without quite understanding why, except that she trusted him with it, in a way she had not expected to trust him with anything, and which she acknowledged to herself was not something she could afford to be sentimental about. She gave him the information about Edric Holt and the theoretical paper. She gave him the connection to Greymount and to Cason Ward. He read the letter with his face very still, and then set it on the desk and folded his hands and looked at the lamp. "Cason Ward," he said. "Not a question." "He has been building a coalition for 20 years, she said. "If he has known, even theoretically, that a convergence might surface, he has had 20 years to prepare for it." 2 attempts in less than a month, Calum said. "Both targeted at suppression rather than death." "Because dead, I am a problem that ends," she said. "Suppressed, I am a resource. A bloodline that carries a convergence, contained and controlled, would be extraordinarily valuable to someone who understood what it was." He looked at her then. The lamp was throwing shadows up the wall behind him, and his face was half lit, and she could see the anger in him clearly. Not the explosive anger she had heard described in stories about his rule, but something colder and more deliberate. The anger of a man who had been moved around someone else's board without knowing it. "He used my palace," Calum said, "my archive, my staff. He had someone inside it for at least 3 years, she said." The silence that followed was not comfortable. She let him sit with it. She understood the specific weight of finding out that something that should have been safe had not been, that the security she believed she controlled had been penetrated quietly and patiently over time. She had felt a version of that when she read the line about Aldrich Moon. She imagined it was considerably sharper for the person responsible for an entire palace. "What do you need?" he asked. Same question, again, clean and direct. She was beginning to understand it was his most characteristic response to a situation he could not control by force. Identify what could be acted on, and act on it. "I need to know how many of Ward's pack have contacts inside the court," she said. "And I need to know before the next attempt, because the next attempt will not be about suppression. Once Ward understands that the proxy suppression is failing, he will move to something more permanent." She paused. "And I need to accelerate." He looked at her. Accelerate what? What is happening inside me? She said. The suppression is weakening. Vera says when it goes, it will go entirely. I have been treating that as something to be cautious about, something to prepare for, to control, to time correctly. But if Ward already knows what I am and is moving against me, then arriving at the convergence on my own terms is safer than being caught at half strength when he makes his next move. Calum was quiet for a long moment. Vera told you it would be intense, he said. I know. You do not know the specifics, he said. He had clearly discussed this more thoroughly with Vera than the sessions she had been present for. Then tell me, she said. He picked up his pen and set it down. When the suppression breaks fully, the silver property will extend outward for a significant radius. Not like the session where you let it out deliberately. That was controlled and brief. This will be sustained and complete. Every wolf within range will feel it. The alpha command structure, my authority, every ranking wolf in the court, will be disrupted for as long as it lasts. She understood. You will lose control of your court. Temporarily, he said. But control, once disrupted, is difficult to re-establish cleanly. People remember. I know, she said. I am asking you to accept that risk. He looked at her. The lamp between them threw light across the desk and the maps on the wall behind her, and she looked back at him and did not look away. If Ward moves first, she said, you lose control permanently. If I move first, you lose control temporarily, and then regain it, alongside someone who is... She stopped. Someone who does not want your authority undermined, she said carefully. I have no interest in power structures. I did not come here to rule anything. I came here because a chain was locked around my wrist, and I was put on a cart, and everything that has happened since has been in reaction to that. But I can tell you honestly that the thing I want most is to understand what I am, and to be allowed to be it, without someone trying to stop me. That is compatible with your court. He looked at her for a very long time. All right, he said. You have said that before, she said. And both times I meant it, he said. She picked up her mother's letter from his desk and folded it carefully. She stood. When? He asked. Vera will know the right conditions, she said. Give me a few days to prepare. I want to go into it fully aware, not caught by surprise. He nodded. She went to the door. Then she turned back, the same way he sometimes did, and she said, the letter. The part at the end, what she wrote about the palace. He looked at her. She planned for all of it, Seraphine said. The hiding, the archive, the timing. She never met you. She never knew who would be here, but she put the letter where I would find it when I was ready, because she knew this place would eventually make me ready. She looked at the maps behind him, at the old borders and the territories that had been drawn and redrawn over centuries. I do not think she trusted the Iron Throne, but I think she understood what it was. What is it? He asked, quietly. The most concentrated point of alpha power in the world, she said. Which means it is the most concentrated point of what came from the first line. She sent me to the place where I would wake up the fastest. She left. In her room, she sat at the table with the letter and read her mother's handwriting one more time. She thought about Elena hiding in Iron Moon with a daughter she was protecting, with every tool she had. She thought about the patience of it, the years of it, the loneliness of knowing something this large and carrying it completely alone. She pressed her hand to her chest. The thing beneath her skin pressed back, warm and steady. 3 days, she thought. 3 days to be ready. It would have to be enough. She spent the 3 days differently than she had spent any time since arriving at the palace. She had always used reading as the primary way she understood the world. Books and documents and the accumulated text of other people's understanding had been her substitute for everything she had not been given. The wolf she did not have, the community she did not belong to, the power she was told she lacked. Reading was how she compensated. It was also, she recognized now, how she kept a safe distance from the things she felt most strongly, because if she was always inside a text, she was never fully inside the moment. She put the texts down. She sat in her room and she breathed, and she turned her attention inward in a way she had always been too careful to do before. The thing beneath her skin was familiar now. It had been familiar since the early weeks, when she had first felt it respond to the pressure of her thumb on her wrist. But she had always treated it carefully, the way you treat something you do not fully understand, with respect that was partly caution. Now she sat with it without the caution, and she let herself simply feel what it was. It was not foreign. That was the first thing she understood, sitting there on the edge of her bed with her eyes closed and her hands loose in her lap. She had been treating it as something separate from herself, something living in her that was not quite her. But it was not separate. It was not a passenger. It was the foundation, the deep structural thing that everything else about her had grown around. What she had been calling herself was the surface. This was underneath everything. She sat with that for a long time. On the second day, Vera came in the morning, and they had the most honest conversation they had yet managed. "Tell me what it will feel like," she said. He sat across from her and considered how to say it truthfully. She had learned to value his commitment to that, the way he reached for accuracy even when it was difficult. "The texts describe it differently for different individuals," he said. "But consistently, the first thing that happens is the perception of weight leaving. You described that when you let the field out in our sessions. This will be the complete version of that feeling." "And then," she said, "and then the field extends outward and sustains itself without deliberate effort. The silver property of your blood becomes continuous rather than reactive. It will be visible, not intensely, but perceptibly. Your skin will have a quality in certain light that other people will notice." He paused, "And every wolf in range will respond to it, not voluntarily. The response is below the level of conscious decision." She thought about what she had read, about anchors. "Like a signal," she said, "at a frequency their wolf responds to." "Essentially, yes," he said. "Something in the wolf nature recognizes the origin point, the way something in the body recognizes the scent of its own family, not decided, just known." "How wide a range?" she asked. "Unknown," he said. "The texts describe it as expanding with the individual's own strength. There is no documented upper limit." He looked at her. "Given what you carry, both lines, in full convergence, I would not estimate." She nodded. "Are you frightened?" he asked. It was unusual for him to ask something that was not clinical, and she recognized it as a sign that he had been sitting with this question for some time. "No," she said. "I am ready." He looked at her with the expression she thought of as the Vera-specific version of emotion, everything suppressed to the surface level except for a quality in the eyes that could not quite be managed. "I think," he said carefully, "that you have been ready for a very long time. The suppression was the only reason it has not happened before now." She spent the third day in the courtyard. Fenwick stood at the entrance and did not interfere, which meant either Calum had told him to give her space, or he had the sense to recognize when someone needed to be alone. She stood in the center of the courtyard, which was stone-paved and bordered by the high walls of the palace's inner structure, and she let the afternoon light fall on her, and she did nothing in particular. She thought about Iron Moon, not with bitterness. She had carried bitterness for years, and it was heavy in a way that did not serve her. She thought about it the way you might think about a place you passed through on a long journey, a place that was uncomfortable, and not meant for you, but that was part of the route nonetheless. She had been born there and had grown there, and had been called hollow there, and none of it had been correct, but all of it had been necessary, because who she was now was partly built from the pressure of who she had not been allowed to be. She thought about her mother standing in a small house in Iron Moon, checking her daughter's skin each night, alone with a secret that weighed everything it weighed. She pressed her hand flat over her heart. She felt the pulse there, her own and the other one, the second rhythm that had been there all her life and that she had finally learned to recognize. She let go. Not deliberately, not with effort. She simply stopped holding. Stopped the careful management, the controlled release, the precise fractions she had been allowing out under Vera's supervision. She stopped all of it, and she just stood in the courtyard and let the morning sunlight fall on her, and let herself be entirely what she was. The light changed. It came from her skin first, the same silver quality she had shown in Vera's sessions, but continuous, sustained, spreading across her arms and up through her collar and across her face, and it did not hurt. It felt exactly as she had described to Vera. Weight leaving, the relief of setting something down that had always been too heavy to carry, the specific physical ease of a burden removed. The courtyard walls seemed to breathe. The silver expanded outward. She felt it go, not saw it, felt it, the way you feel your own hand moving without looking at it. It moved through the stone walls like they were not there. It moved through the corridors beyond. It was not aggressive. It did not take or demand anything. It simply was, in the way that the origin of something is simply what everything else came from. From somewhere inside the palace, she heard a sound she had not expected. Not an alarm, not running footsteps. A collective stillness, like every sound in the building had paused at once to listen. She heard, very distantly, through 2 walls and a floor, a single clear sound, something being set down. Something metal, very carefully, by hands, that had gone steady out of surprise rather than intention. She stayed still in the courtyard and let it extend and sustain, and she breathed, and she felt, for the first time in her 21 years of life, entirely and completely herself. When Caleb came into the courtyard, he was alone. He had left Fenwick at the door, she understood, because he had wanted to come in alone. She heard his footsteps, and she opened her eyes, and the silver was still extended, still illuminating her skin, and he stopped when he saw it. Just for a moment, a half-step pause, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before. He looked at her the way you look at something when you understand it for the first time, not studying, not assessing, just looking. "Is this it?" he asked. His voice was different, quieter than usual, and without the careful professional measure she was used to. "Yes," she said, "this is it." He came closer, not quickly, not cautiously, just walking toward her in the ordinary way of someone who has decided something. He stopped when he was 3 feet from her, and the silver light from her skin was falling on him slightly, and she watched his face with her full attention. His wolf, she realized, had gone completely quiet. Not submissive the way a beta went quiet under an alpha command. Quiet the way a river goes quiet at the ocean. Not lessened, not diminished, but arrived. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the question Corin asked her. She had not expected to hear it from him. "I am better than all right," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he said something that was quiet enough that she might almost have been unsure she heard it correctly, except that she was very good at hearing things that were not said loudly. "I know," he said. She let the silver settle, not withdraw entirely. It was not something that was going to be put away again, but she let it reduce to a steady background quality, present without demanding, the way moonlight is present without requiring acknowledgement. "The court felt it," she said. "Yes," he said. "How bad?" she asked. "Not bad," he said. "Surprising. Disorienting. For about 3 minutes. 37 wolves in the building at the time. The ranking ones felt it most." He paused. "My head of guard came to me saying she did not understand what she felt, and I told her it was a phenomenon being studied. She accepted that." Another pause, very brief. "She is also still standing straighter than she has in years." Seraphine almost smiled. "The anchor effect," she said. "Is that what it is called?" he said. "In the oldest texts," she said, "it is not dominance. It is more like settling. The wolf nature in everyone around is a little more at ease." He looked at her. "I noticed," he said. And then quietly, "I am included in that." She looked back at him. The afternoon light was golden, and the courtyard walls were high, and everything was very still. She was standing in the middle of the palace of the Alpha King, with silver light moving through her skin, and the most powerful wolf in the known world was standing 3 feet away from her, and his face was open in a way she suspected no one had seen in a very long time. There was nothing that needed to be said yet. But she did not look away. And neither did he. That night, word arrived by fast courier from a post station 2 territories to the east. Cason Ward had called a meeting of the Interterritorial Council. 6-pack alphas, emergency session, 3 weeks from now. Subject, a threat to the natural order of the pack world. Seraphine read the message when Fenwick brought it to her room. She sat with it and thought about what 3 weeks meant, and what emergency sessions of the council had historically preceded, and she thought about the man in the gray uniform, and the seer in the corridor, and the compound on the archive table, and she knew, in the clear, cold, certain way she knew things, when all the pieces were finally in the right places, that whatever was coming in 3 weeks was not going to look like a meeting. She sent for Vera. When he arrived, she gave him the message and watched him read it. His face went through several careful things, and settled on a particular quality of focused concern that she had learned to distinguish from his general professional seriousness. This was not academic concern. This was personal. "He is moving faster than I expected," Vera said. He felt the field extend, she said. He has contacts in this court. He knows what happened this afternoon. He is moving before it gets stronger. Vera set the message down. What do you intend to do? I intend to be ready, she said, and I intend not to wait to be acted on. She stood and moved to the window. Below, the courtyard was dark and quiet, the stone clean in the moonlight. She looked at her own reflection in the glass, faint and silver-edged, and she thought about her mother saying, "It was always meant to be found." She was found. She was awake. She was here. Let Ward bring his counsel, and his emergency session, and his 20 years of careful preparation. She had a lifetime of her own. She did not tell Calum about the courier message that night. She told him in the morning, at the standing meeting, handing him the paper while Vera sat in the corner reviewing the documents on the Interterritorial Council's composition. He read it once, and set it down with the careful, flat precision of a man managing his response. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she confirmed. He cannot bring a military force to a council meeting, Calum said, thinking aloud. She had learned to recognize this mode. The voice slightly different, addressed to the problem rather than to her. The council has rules around that, but he can bring a majority. How many of the 6 are aligned with him, she asked. I know 2 who are not, he said. Which means the other 3 are either aligned with Ward, neutral, or persuadable. I would like to speak with them before the meeting, she said. He looked at her. The Alphas? Yes, she said. Not as a formal approach. Informally if possible. Through intermediaries, or through the contact system the court already has with the PACs. She looked at him steadily. I am not asking you to arrange it for me. I am telling you what I am planning, because it involves your diplomatic network, and I think you deserve to know. Something shifted in his expression. You are consulting me, he said. Rather than informing me. I am trying to, she said. A pause. I appreciate the distinction, he said. And then, without any particular ceremony, I will set up the communications. I have better contacts than you do, and faster channels. It makes sense to use them. Thank you, she said. Vera looked up from the corner and said nothing, but she saw the expression on his face, and she stored it alongside all the other things she had stored, that she was not ready to examine directly yet. The preparations over the following 10 days were the most complex things she had ever been involved in. The court, which had been arranged around Calum's singular authority for 9 years, had to be quietly, carefully restructured around a new reality, not replaced, adjusted. The ranking wolves who had felt the silver field extending that afternoon in the courtyard needed to understand what it was, not fear it, not resist it, not be surprised by it a second time when it mattered. Calum called the senior court wolves together in the main hall and told them, not everything, not the full history, not the first Alpha Wars, not the politics of what was coming. He told them that a member of an ancient bloodline had arrived in the court, and that the field they had felt was a natural property of that bloodline, and not an attack, and not a malfunction of their own wolf nature. He told them that this person was under his protection, and under the court's protection, and that her presence was a strategic asset in a situation that was developing. He did not introduce her. He said her name. He said, Seraphine Ashwood, currently residing in the East Wing. 44 wolves in that room, and not one of them argued. She heard about it afterward from Fenwick, who had been there, and she sat with the image of it. Calum Draskin standing in front of his senior staff, and placing her name in the room as something to be protected, and she felt something move through her that was not entirely comfortable. She had not asked him to do that. She had not planned for it. He had done it because it needed to be done, and because he had decided to do it, without consulting her, the way she had told him her plan to contact the Alphas without asking his permission. They had each, without discussing it, begun to move in parallel on each other's behalf. She turned this over for several days without arriving at a conclusion about it that felt complete. On the 12th day, one of the neutral Alphas responded to the contact Calum had established. His name was Edmund Gale. He was the Alpha of Westbridge Pack, and his message was brief. He wanted a private meeting before the council session. He was willing to travel to the Iron Throne. He was not willing to wait. He arrived 4 days before the council meeting with a small guard and the particular energy of a man who had already made a decision and had come to understand the terms of it. He met with Seraphine in the reading room, not the formal study, her choice, which Calum had not objected to. Edmund Gale was in his 50s. gray-haired and direct, with the careful, settled authority of a man who had been alpha long enough to know which things were worth fighting about. He looked at her for a long moment when he came in, the way people looked at her now, with a slight adjustment behind the eyes, the wolf inside responding to something the person was still catching up to. Then he sat down across from her and said, "Tell me what you are." She told him. She gave him the history, the first line, the hunts, the suppression, her mother's letter, the convergence. She gave him the current situation with Ward. She was not diplomatic about any of it. Diplomatic was a version of managing what the other person received, and she had decided that Edmund Gale was in this room because he wanted truth, and the only thing she had to offer was exactly that. When she was finished, he was quiet for a long time. "If Ward's coalition succeeds," he said finally, "and you are taken, what happens to the rest of us?" "Nothing immediately," she said. "But Ward's goal is not simply to prevent me from being what I am. It is to have access to what I carry. Controlled access. And a man who understands that kind of power, and wants to own it, will not stop at owning one thing. He will come for the neutrals next," Gale said, not a question. "He will consolidate," she said. "That is what 20 years of coalition building looks like in practice." Gale looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "What are you offering?" "Nothing," she said. "I am not in a position to offer anything formally. I am not an alpha. I have no territory. And this meeting is entirely unofficial." She met his gaze. "What I can tell you is that what I am is incompatible with the kind of consolidation Ward is planning. Not because I am planning to oppose it, but because the nature of what I carry is opposed to the suppression and control of wolf nature in any form. If you stand with the Iron Throne, you are standing with something that will not try to own you." Edmund Gale looked at her for another long moment. Then he did something she had not expected from a 50-year-old alpha who had run a pack through 3 territorial crises. He smiled. "Your mother taught you to speak plainly," he said. She looked at him. "How did you know about my mother?" "I did not," he said. "I am guessing, from the way you use language. Someone taught you that the truth is the most efficient tool." He stood. "I will bring my vote to the council. I cannot guarantee the others." "I know," she said. "But I can work on them," he said, with the brisk practicality of a man who had spent decades doing exactly that. He left. Seraphine sat in the reading room alone for a few minutes, and then she stood and went to find Calum, because they had 2 days before the council arrived, and a great deal still to arrange. She found him in the map room, standing at the largest map, the one that covered the full territorial spread of the known pack world, every boundary and every pack name written in the precise hand of someone who had updated it personally over many years. He heard her come in, and did not turn immediately, which she had come to understand as his version of giving himself a moment. "Edmund Gale is with us," she said. He turned then. His face was doing the steady, compressed thing it did, when something was going better than he had allowed himself to expect. "Good," he said. "That leaves 2. He thinks he can work on them," she said. "Before the session." Calum nodded. He looked at the map for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she saw something in his face that was not about strategy, or Gale, or Ward, or the council. It was the expression she had been filing away for weeks, the one she had not found a name for. She named it now, standing in the map room 2 days before the most important thing that had happened in the pack world in decades. It was not complicated. It was simple and old, and she recognized it, because, if she was being completely honest with herself, she had been looking at him with something like it for some time. She said nothing about it. There was too much to do, and no time to be sentimental. But she held the name of it, quietly, and she did not put it away. They had work to do. The council session was scheduled for the morning. The alphas arrived the afternoon before, each with a small formal party, and the palace received them with the quiet efficiency of a court that had done this many times and was not impressed by its own ceremony. Seraphine watched the arrivals from a high window in the east corridor, old habit, the east corridor, and catalogued the faces and body language of 6-pack leaders descending from carriages and horses into the courtyard below. Cason Ward arrived last. She had expected him to arrive first. First arrival was a power statement, the move of a man who wanted everyone else to be waiting for him, and the late arrival recalibrated what she thought she knew about him. He arrived in a plain carriage, with 4 guards rather than 6, and he was wearing clothes that were expensive, in the same quiet way Vera's were. He did not look at the palace with the expression of a man conducting a hostile visit. He looked at it the way you look at a building where you are about to do business, assessing but not adversarial. Comfortable. That was the most concerning thing about him. He was comfortable. Seraphine moved away from the window. Edmund Gale had made contact with the other two neutral alphas in the 36 hours since his meeting with her. She did not know what he had said to them. She did not ask. She had learned, from a lifetime of working in the small spaces, that specific outcomes required letting other people use their own methods, and Gale was a man who knew his own methods. One of the two had sent a brief response through the court's diplomatic channel, considering. The other had not responded at all, which could mean anything. She spent the evening in her room, going over the structure of the council session with Calum. The formal protocol for interterritorial council meetings was old and rigid and detailed, the kind of rule set established by people who understood that when powerful individuals shared a room under tension, having an exact sequence of events that everyone had agreed to in advance was the difference between a meeting and a confrontation. She had read the protocol document from cover to cover twice and had specific thoughts about 4 of its provisions. Calum listened to all of them. He did not always agree. Twice he pushed back. With reasoning she tested against her own and found solid. But the fact of the listening was something she had noticed from early in their working relationship. He did not listen to appear cooperative. He listened because he had decided her thinking was worth engaging with. Ward will raise the natural order clause, she said. Section 7. It allows any council member to call for the removal or isolation of an element the council collectively determines to be a threat to the stability of pack society. He has to get a majority to invoke it, Calum said. He came here thinking he had one, she said. He may still think he does, Calum said. He does not know about Gale. She nodded. Which is an advantage, but not a decisive one. If he gets 4 votes, the clause is invoked regardless of your opposition. You can object on procedural grounds, but the appeal process takes 60 days, Calum said. In which time he could do anything, she said. A pause. They looked at each other across the desk. I want to be in the room, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That is not in the protocol. I know, she said, but the natural order clause, if invoked, concerns me directly. Under Section 12, a subject of a Clause 7 invocation has the right to present a statement of standing. He had read the same document. She saw the recognition in his face. That right was originally designed for pack alphas being subjected to territorial removal, he said, not for individuals. It does not specify, she said. The language is broad. I think it was written broadly intentionally. Whoever drafted it wanted the provision to be flexible. She looked at him. I want to be in the room, and I want to speak. Not to argue a case, just to be there. Another pause. Ward will see you as confirmation that what he claims is real, Calum said. He already knows it is real, she said. He has known for weeks. What he has not done yet is see me in person. She let that sit for a moment. Let him see me. The silence that followed was the kind that meant he was genuinely thinking it through rather than managing his response. She had learned the difference. All right, he said. The morning of the council session, she woke before dawn and lay in the dark and breathed, and did not feel afraid. She took stock of herself the way you take stock before something significant, honestly, without flattery or self-pity. She was 21 years old. She had come to this palace in chains less than 2 months ago, believing herself to be nothing. She had learned in those weeks what she actually was, had read the history of her own people, in documents a floor below the room she was sitting in, had found her mother's letter in an archive, where it had been waiting for her, with the patience of someone who loved her completely, and had trusted her enough to let her find the way on her own. She was frightened of nothing that was going to happen in that council room today. She was, if she was precise about it, something closer to certain, the kind of certainty that is not arrogance but simply the specific clarity that comes when you have gathered enough information to understand a situation completely. Fenwick came at first light. He did not speak, which was correct. She dressed, braided her hair, and was ready before the palace had fully woken. The council chamber was in the center of the palace, which she had not seen before. It was not large. The protocol called for a single table with 8 positions, and the room was sized accordingly. With stone walls and no decoration, except for the same maps she associated with Calum's study, this set mounted and framed with more ceremony. She came in before the alphas arrived, through a door in the back that let her stand to one side, near the wall, in a position that was not formally at the table but was clearly within the room. The alphas came in over the next 15 minutes in the formal order the protocol dictated. She watched each of them as they entered. Most of them looked at her, some briefly, some with more sustained attention. Cason Ward was the last of the 6 to take his seat, and he looked at her with the settled, assessing attention of someone who had been given a detailed description and was now confirming the accuracy of it. He was not afraid. She had expected some version of caution, but what she saw was something closer to calculated calm. He had come here thinking he held the majority, and the sight of her had not disrupted that confidence. He looked at her the way a man looks at an outcome he has already planned for. She did not respond to this in any visible way. She stood where she was and paid attention. Calum sat at the head of the table, host position, also Alpha King, both things operating simultaneously, and called the session to order in the language the protocol specified, and then the formal business began. The first 2 provisions were procedural and went quickly. The third was Ward's opening. He presented it calmly, with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this speech many times in his mind and had arrived at a version he considered correct. He described a development he called unprecedented and concerning. He described the arrival of an individual at the Iron Throne, whose blood properties represented a threat to the stability of the established pack structure. He named, carefully and precisely, the Section 7 clause and the history of its application. He framed it as protective, a measure taken out of concern for the long-term health of pack society, not out of hostility toward any individual. He was very good at this. She listened to every word. When he finished, there was a pause in which the alphas who were inclined toward him visibly gathered themselves to agree. Then Edmund Gale spoke. He was brief. He said that before the council moved to a vote, he would like the individual named in the clause to exercise her right under Section 12. He cited the provision exactly, including the provision number, which told her he had prepared for this, and that Calum had likely communicated with him about it. He seconded his own motion before Ward could object. Ward's expression did not change. He looked at Gale with something that was not quite surprise, and then he looked at the 2 neutral alphas who had not responded before the meeting, and she saw something shift in his careful composure. Slightly. Just slightly. Section 12 allows for a statement of standing, one of the other alphas said. A woman named Alpha Lorne of Ashfield, one of Ward's aligned members, who was apparently prepared to allow the provision, while still believing her vote was secure. We can hear it. Seraphine walked to the table. She did not sit. She stood at the single position that was set without a chair, which was the Section 12 position, and she looked around the table at 6-pack alphas, and the king at the head, and she said what she had decided to say. She did not argue. She did not defend herself, because what she was did not require defense. She told them, simply and directly, what the first line was, where it had come from, what had happened to it, and what was standing in front of them now. She told them about her mother's letter. She told them about the compound in the archive and the seer in the corridor. She named Aldrich Moon, whose investigation had by that point confirmed his connection to Greymount, and she said calmly that both attempts had been organized from outside this court, that the authorization came from someone with a specific interest in preventing her from being what she was, and that the council should consider whose interests were served by her suppression, and who stood to gain from controlling a convergence bloodline, rather than destroying it. She did not look at Ward while she said any of this. She looked at the 2 alphas who had not responded to Gale's approach. She said, I am not asking for protection. I am not asking for recognition or title, or anything that requires your gift. I am asking only that you understand what you would be voting for under Section 7, and who would benefit from that vote. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Ward began to speak, and his voice was measured and his framing was careful, but the quality of the room had changed and he knew it. She could see him know it, a slight recalibration, a fraction of adjustment in the controlled certainty he had worn since he walked in. The first of the 2 undecided alphas spoke before Ward finished his sentence. He said, I am not prepared to vote today. I want to adjourn and consider. His voice was not apologetic. It was the voice of a man who had just seen something he had not expected and was handling it with the only tool available to a person of integrity: honesty about uncertainty. Ward looked at him. The second undecided alpha said, "Seconded." The room was very quiet for a moment that lasted several seconds and then stretched further. Ward looked at Calum. Calum looked back at him with an expression that was completely, deliberately neutral, not triumphant, not tense. Just the careful face of a man waiting to see what the next move would be. "An adjournment is procedurally allowable," Calum said. "Does anyone object?" No one spoke. "Then we adjourn until tomorrow morning," Calum said. Ward gathered his papers with the efficiency of someone who was not finished, but was experienced enough to know when to stop. He stood. He looked across the room at Seraphine for one moment, and she looked back at him. And for the first time since he had arrived, she saw something in his face that was not the settled comfort of a man executing a plan. It was the face of a man revising one. She was not relieved. She was alert, because a man who had spent 20 years building something and had just encountered a setback was not a man who stopped. He was a man who changed strategy. The council members filed out. Fenwick appeared at her side. She walked out through the side door without looking back at the room. In the corridor, she stopped and stood against the cold stone wall and let herself, for exactly 10 seconds, feel how tired she was. Then she straightened and moved toward the study, where she knew Calum would be within the next 5 minutes. They had bought one day. They had not won anything yet. But they were still standing, and that was enough to work with. Calum arrived at the study before her. She found him already standing at the desk, not looking at anything on it, which told her he had come straight here, without stopping, for the same reason she had. There was too much to think about to be anywhere else. "Well," she said. "Better than it was this morning," he said. "Not secure." "No," she agreed. She moved to the chair across from him and sat, which was not something she usually did in this room. She usually stood. But the morning had used something in her, and sitting was honest about that. "Ward will spend tonight working on the two undecideds." "I know," Calum said. He sat down too. "Gale will also be working. It depends on which of them is more persuasive, and which of the two alphas is more persuadable by which kind of argument. Ward will use security framing," she said. "Pack stability, long-term risk, the unpredictability of an uncontrolled convergence. He will be careful not to make it personal." "And what would move them in the other direction?" Calum asked. She thought about the two alphas she had been watching all morning. The woman, Cassia Holt of Northmere. She responded to the Section 12 statement. "She was watching me, not the room, the whole time I spoke. She is principled in a specific way, the kind that finds the use of institutional process for personal gain distasteful." She paused. "She needs to understand exactly what Ward intends to use the Clause 7 vote for. Not in general terms, specifically." "You mean the controlled bloodline angle?" Calum said. "Yes. Gale should tell her directly. Cassia Holt will not vote to hand someone over to be owned." He nodded. He was writing, rapidly, on a piece of paper. "And the other one? Harlan Beck of Eastmore." "Beck is older," she said. "He has held his pack for a long time. He is cautious in the way of someone who has survived by moving carefully. The adjournment was his first response, and it was a protective response. He is not sure, and when he is not sure, he does nothing." She thought for a moment. "He needs certainty in a different direction than Cassia does. He does not need principle. He needs safety." "Safety how?" Calum said. "He needs to know that the Iron Throne will hold," she said. "That if he votes against Ward, he is voting with something stable, not just against something threatening." She looked at Calum. "He needs to meet you before the morning session. Not at a diplomatic distance. Actually meet you. Talk." Calum looked at her. "Tonight." "Tonight," she confirmed. He set the pen down. "I will arrange it." He looked at her for a moment. "You have been studying them since they arrived, haven't you?" "Since yesterday afternoon," she said. "Window in the east corridor." "Of course," he said. There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. She had noticed this appearing more frequently in the last 2 weeks. She had not mentioned it. She found she liked it. They spent the next 2 hours going over the arrangement of the following morning's session, if different outcomes occurred. If Cassia voted with them, the clause failed unless Beck voted with Ward, in which case it was a tie. and Calum chair broke it. If Beck voted with them, and Cassia remained uncertain, still in their favor. If Ward managed to pull one of them back and not the other. Variable, requiring immediate procedural response. She was sharp with numbers. She could hold all the permutations simultaneously, and track the implications of each. She did not know if this was because of the convergence or simply because she had always thought this way, but it was useful, and Calum used it. Turned to her twice during the strategy session to ask her to confirm a sequence she had already worked through, and accepted her answer both times without checking it against his own count. At one point she said, "You trust my arithmetic." He looked up from the notes. "Should I not?" "Most people want to verify," she said. He considered it. "Most people do not have 200 years of bloodline information in their working memory," he said. She said, "I have not been counting them." He looked at her, with the small, steady attention she was most familiar with from him. "I know," he said. "I was not being literal." She understood. He was saying something else. He was saying that he trusted her in a way that did not require verification, and that this was specific rather than general, and that he was aware of the difference. She received this information and put it with the other things she was not examining directly yet. When Harlan Beck came to the study at the 9th hour of the evening, Calum spoke with him alone for 45 minutes. Seraphine waited in the corridor with Fenwick and did not strain to hear through the door. She trusted Calum's judgment in a room with another alpha more than her own. The dynamics of that interaction were his native language in a way they were not hers. When Beck left, his expression was different from when he arrived. Not decided. He was not a man who decided quickly, and she had known going in that he would not emerge certain. But he was calmer. The protective caution had reduced by a fraction, which was all she had hoped for. "What did you tell him?" she asked, when Calum came back into the corridor. "The truth," he said. "I told him that what is in this palace right now is the most significant thing to happen in Pack history since the founding of the Interterritorial Council. I told him that the right side of significant things is the side where you choose with your own judgment, rather than being pointed by someone else's interest. And I told him." He stopped. "What?" she said. He looked at her, and the careful professional distance was not there. It had not been fully there for some time, but in the corridor, in the lateness of the evening, with the big meeting a few hours away, it was simply gone. "I told him that I have never, in 9 years of this throne, made a choice about a person based on something I felt before I understood it," he said, "and that I am not in the habit of doubting my own instincts once I have examined them thoroughly." She looked at him. "He understood what I was telling him," Calum said. "So do I," she said quietly. A pause. "Go to sleep," he said, which was what he said when he had arrived at the edge of something he was not ready to move through yet. She recognized it. She was not ready yet either. But the edge was there, and they were both standing at it, and she thought that was, in itself, enough for tonight. "You too," she said. She went to her room. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about everything that was at stake in the morning, and everything that needed to go correctly, and all the ways it could fail, and then she thought about Calum's face in the corridor, and she thought about her mother's letter, and she thought about what it meant to be the thing everything else came from. It meant you could not be reduced. You could be hidden, as her mother had hidden her, or you could be suppressed, as the ritual had suppressed her, but you could not be made into something lesser, because lesser was not in the structure of what she was. It was a quality, like density. You could coat the surface with other things, but the underlying material remained unchanged. She had been hollow for 21 years. She had never been hollow. She fell asleep holding that, and she slept well. The morning session began at the same hour as the previous day, and the room had a different quality from the moment the alphas took their seats. The atmosphere of calculated positioning that had marked the first morning was still present, but underneath it, there was something else. Something that had happened overnight, in private conversations, in the careful revision of positions, in the particular silence of people who had been given new information and had spent the dark hours deciding what to do with it. Seraphine stood again in the side position. She had asked Fenwick to wait outside the door, which he had done without comment. She wanted to be the only person in the room who was not at the table, because it meant she could watch all of them simultaneously, without any one of them being able to claim her attention was directed at them personally. Ward opened. He had not been idle overnight. She could see it in the way he was arranged, the papers before him reorganized, the framing he began with slightly adjusted from the previous day. He had been told about her Section 12 statement, and he had prepared a response, which was, the rights under that provision were specifically intended for entities with established PAC standing, and as an unregistered individual with no PAC affiliation, she did not qualify. It was a good argument. It was technically plausible. The provision language was broad but not unambiguous, and Ward had found the ambiguity and was using it. Before she could speak, before she had decided whether to speak, Cassia Holt of Northmere said, "The provision does not require PAC affiliation. It requires the individual to be the subject of the Clause 7 invocation. That requirement is met." Ward looked at her with an expression that was very controlled. The historical application has always been. Historical application does not override provision language, Cassia said. I have read it 3 times this morning. Seraphine did not let anything change on her face. Ward shifted his framing. He spent the next 15 minutes building the security argument she had anticipated. The risk of an uncontrolled convergence. The unpredictability of a power structure that did not operate within the established alpha hierarchy. The precedent set by allowing it to remain unregulated. It was well reasoned. Parts of it were not wrong. A convergence bloodline with no accountability and no integration into the existing structure could, theoretically, be a source of instability. She waited until he finished. Then she said, "May I respond?" Ward looked at her. Calum said, "Section 12 allows for response." She did not stand up from where she was. She spoke from her position at the side, which meant everyone had to turn slightly to look at her, which meant the focus of the room moved away from Ward's table position for the first time. "The security concern is a real one," she said. "An uncontrolled convergence in an environment that does not understand it would be destabilizing. I agree with that. The question is not whether the concern is valid, but what the correct response to it is." She looked at Ward directly for the first time since she had been in the room. The response being proposed is isolation, and in practice, transfer of the individual to a controlled environment. What that means, practically, is removal from this court and confinement in conditions determined by the proposing party. She paused. "I would ask the council to name openly what controlled means in this context. Not in general terms, specifically." Ward said, "The protocol for Clause 7 transfer includes oversight by the invoking party." She said, "Yes, which in this instance is you." She looked at him. "A convergence bloodline under your oversight, in facilities you control, is not a security measure for the Interterritorial Council. It is a resource for Greymount PAC." The room went quiet, in a specific way. Ward was very still. Edmund Gale said, "I would like the record to note that Greymount PAC has had at least 2 agents operating within the Iron Throne's palace in the past 30 days, with the objective of suppressing the individual in question's blood properties through chemical means. This is documented." Calum looked at Ward. "The documentation is correct," he said. "The investigation is ongoing." The quality of the silence changed again. Harlan Beck had been looking at the table since Seraphine began speaking. She watched him without appearing to. His hands were flat on the table, very still, the posture of someone who has arrived at a decision and is waiting for the moment to state it. He stated it. "I withdraw my support for the adjournment," he said. "I am prepared to vote." Ward's eyes went to him. Something in Ward's composed certainty had cracked, finally. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone not paying close attention. But she had been paying close attention since he walked into the palace yesterday. "As am I," Cassia Holt said. The vote was called. The Section 7 clause failed by 5-1. Ward voted in favor. Every other alpha at the table voted against. She had not expected 5. She had hoped for 4. 5 was something she had not prepared herself for, and the extra margin, when it came, moved through her with a force she had not anticipated. Cassia and Beck she had worked for. The 2 alphas who had been aligned with Ward had broken away. She looked at the 2 who had changed, and one of them met her eyes briefly. A woman named Alpha Pharaoh of Crestfield, whose expression said plainly that what she had heard in this room in the last 2 days had been sufficient to change a position she had walked in holding. The session moved into the formal closing protocol. Ward remained in his seat through all of it, completing each required step with the mechanical efficiency of a man who would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him leave early. When it was finished and the alphas began to move, he stood and gathered his things, and he looked at her one more time across the room. She met his gaze steadily. He said nothing. He turned and left. Gale stopped beside her on his way out. He did not say much. He was not a man of many words and moments that had already said everything. He looked at her and said, "Well done." And she said, "Thank you for Cassia." And he nodded once and moved on. The room emptied. Calum was the last one at the table. He had been managing the formal closure of the session and had not been able to look at her directly for the last 20 minutes, which she understood was because looking at her directly in a room full of other alphas when the outcome was still running would have communicated something specific about the relationship between them that he had not decided to communicate yet. The room was empty now. He looked at her. She looked back. "5, she said. "5, he agreed. His voice was different from the careful, managed tone of the session. Not loose, but honest, which was its own quality. "Pharaoh surprised me." "Pharaoh is principled in a way that looks practical until you pressure test it," she said. Ward thought she was a reliable vote because she agreed with his position on paper. But her agreement was conditional on the means, and the means offended her. He studied her. He studied her. "You identified that this morning?" "Yesterday afternoon," she said. "At the window." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me." She followed him out of the chamber, through the corridor, and into the map room rather than the study. She had noticed he made different choices about which room to go to, depending on the kind of conversation he wanted to have. The study was for strategy. The map room was for something else, something less managed. She had been trying to determine what for 3 weeks. He stood at the large map, the one that showed all the territories, and he did not look at it. He looked at the floor for a moment, in the way that meant he was organizing something internally. Then he looked at her. "I told Harlan Beck something last night," he said. "You told me," she said, "that you do not doubt your instincts once you have examined them." "I told him that in the context of a general argument," he said. "I am telling you now, in the context of a specific one." She waited. "You came here in chains," he said, "sent here as someone else's joke, with no power, and no standing, and no name that anyone here recognized. In less than 2 months you have identified your own bloodline, discovered a conspiracy inside my palace, contributed to the strategy that just protected you from a council vote, and changed the political landscape of the interterritorial relationship in ways that are going to keep developing for years." He paused. "And you have been honest with me at every step, even when honesty was the harder choice, even when it would have been simpler to manage what I knew, or defer to what I wanted." She was very still. "I have been the Alpha King for 9 years, he said. In 9 years, I have not trusted anyone fully, not because I am incapable of it, because the situation has never presented someone I could trust fully, without strategic risk." He looked at her. "You are the first person in 9 years whose judgment I have trusted, without reserving some portion of mine, as a check on yours." She said, "That is a large thing to say." "I know," he said. "I have been deciding whether to say it for about 2 weeks." She looked at him, and she was not afraid, and she was not uncertain, and she was not performing composure. She was simply present, the same way she had been present in the courtyard when the suppression broke and the silver moved outward, entirely and completely herself, without management. "I have also been deciding something for 2 weeks," she said. "What?" he said. "Whether I trust you in return," she said, "and whether I can trust myself to distinguish between trusting you because it is correct and trusting you because I want to." He was watching her very closely. "I have decided," she said, "that those 2 things are not as different as I was treating them. What I want, and what is correct, have the same answer." A moment passed between them that had weight and shape and the particular texture of something real. He did not move toward her. She did not move toward him. They stood 8 feet apart with the map of the entire known world behind him, and she held that moment, and she let it be what it was, and she did not rush it or manage it or translate it into something more comfortable. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet. "What do you need?" he asked. Same question. Again. Always the same question. And she loved him for it. She realized, in the clear, settled, suddenly obvious way, that you recognize something true when you have stopped looking away from it. She said, Right now? To sleep for 12 hours and eat something substantial. The strategy session can wait until tomorrow. The corner of his mouth moved. Not almost. All the way. Go, he said. She went, and she carried the shape of his face with her, and for the first time since arriving in chains at the gate of the Iron Throne's palace, she walked through the corridor without any weight that was not her own. She slept for 10 hours instead of 12, which was the closest she had come to the number in weeks, and woke with the particular clarity that comes from genuine rest. Everything sharp and well lit, no fog at the edges. She ate, and it was the first meal since arriving at the palace that she ate without any portion of her attention on strategy or threat or what came next. She sat at the table in her room, with bread and eggs and warm broth, and she tasted all of it, and she watched the light move through her window, and she let the morning be just a morning. The problem, which she already knew, and which came back to her with its full weight after breakfast, was that the council vote had not ended anything. It had prevented a specific action by a specific mechanism. It had not removed Cason Ward from his position, had not dismantled the coalition he had spent 20 years building, and had not addressed the 2 agents he had placed inside the palace, one of whom was Aldrich Moon, who was still under observation but not yet detained. She sent for Vera. He arrived mid-morning looking like a man who had not slept, which she suspected was accurate. He had attended the council session, though not inside the chamber. Calum had arranged for him to be in an adjacent room where summaries were relayed. His face had the over-alert quality of someone running on information and stimulation rather than rest. "Sit down," she said. "You look terrible." He sat. "Thank you," he said, with the dry precision that was his version of being warm. "The vote outcome?" 5 against 1, she said. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the over-alert quality had reduced slightly, like a machine that had been running at capacity and had just been permitted to step down. "Good," he said simply. "We are not finished," she said. "Ward will regroup. The mechanisms he used inside the palace, Moon, the 2 others we have not identified, those channels are still open until we close them, and he will have people in the other packs who report back. He will know the vote outcome before the end of the day." "What do you need from me?" Vera asked. She looked at him. He had asked that question with the complete, uncomplicated directness of someone who had genuinely stopped operating as an independent agent and had placed his resources at her disposal. She was not sure exactly when that had happened. Somewhere between the archive sessions and the night she had told him about the convergence, the balance of their relationship had shifted, and what she had initially been in his world, an extraordinary subject, had become something different, something he had not had a word for either. "I need to understand the reach of the silver field," she said. "Not theoretically. Precisely. What range, what intensity, and whether there is any way to extend it beyond its natural radius with intention." He straightened. "That is in the territory of the advanced texts," he said. "There are 3 documents in the lower archive I have not yet been able to fully translate. The language is archaic and technical. I have been working on them for 2 weeks." "Work faster," she said, "and tell me what you find as you find it, not when you have the complete picture." He nodded. He stood, paused. "Seraphine," he said, for the second time using her name without any other framing. "What Ward is planning now, after yesterday, will not go through the council mechanism. He burned that option." "I know," she said. "He will go outside the structure," Vera said. "He has contacts and resources, and he has had 20 years to build contingencies." "I know," she said again. "I am planning for that." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she thought of as his most honest face, not the studied physician, not the careful researcher, but the man underneath who had spent 30 years looking for something he had given up believing existed and had found it, and was still adjusting to that. "You always know," he said quietly. "That is either very reassuring or very alarming, and I have not decided which." She said, "It can be both." He left, and she sat with her tea, and she thought about Ward outside the council structure, about what resources he had and how he would use them, and she thought about what had changed for her in the last day. The vote, the map room, the realization she had carried with her to bed and woken up with, unchanged by sleep. Calum came at midday. He came without announcement, which was usual. He sat across from her at the small table in her room, rather than suggesting they move to the study, which was something new, and she noted it without making anything visible of the noting. "How are you?" he asked. It was not "how are you" in the standard sense. It was the genuine question, the one he asked about the thing underneath the situation. She had learned to answer it honestly. "Better than yesterday," she said. "Not finished." "No," he said. "Ward will move through unofficial channels." He said it the same way she had said it to Vera, which meant they had arrived at the same assessment independently, which was not surprising, but was the kind of alignment she had noticed increasing, and which she valued more than she had expected to. "His timing will depend on how quickly he can reassemble his resources," she said. "He lost something yesterday. Not his coalition, which is still intact, but the pretense of legitimate process. He cannot use the council mechanism again without new grounds. He will look for new grounds. Which means he needs more information about what you are and what you can do," Calum said. "Which means the agents inside the palace are more important to him than ever," she said. "He will not want to pull them now. He will want to use them." "We let Moon keep moving," he said. "We let Moon keep moving," she agreed. "And we watch who he contacts." Calum was quiet for a moment. "The 5 who voted against are not all secure," he said. "Pharaoh surprised me, but surprise can go the other direction too." "Pharaoh is committed," she said. "She is principled, and she committed publicly. Walking it back would cost her more than maintaining it." Beck needs the ground to stay stable," she said. "As long as the Iron Throne presents as stable, he will stay aligned. If Ward creates instability, engineered events, territorial disruptions, anything that makes the current situation look unmanageable, Beck may recalculate." Calum considered this. "Then the priority is stability," he said. "Inside the palace, and in the territories close to Eastmore." "And information," she said. "I want to know what Ward does in the next 7 days. Every contact, every message, every carriage that leaves Greymount." "I have people for that," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I am not managing the intelligence network. I am telling you what I need from it." Something in his expression shifted. "You are telling me what you need," he repeated. "I have been doing that for a while," she said. "You have," he said. He was looking at her with the full, unblinking attention that was so characteristic of him, and it was doing what it always did, which was make her feel entirely seen, in a way that was simultaneously direct and completely unhurried. "I have been paying attention to when you tell me what you need, and when you tell me what you are planning, and when you simply tell me what you are thinking. You modulate those 3 things very specifically." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "What am I doing now?" "Telling me what you need," he said. "Which means you trust me to provide it." "Yes," she said. The quiet between them was not empty. It was the kind of quiet that has been earned by weeks of difficulty and honesty, and the particular intimacy of solving hard things together in real time. She said, "When this is over, when Ward is fully addressed, and the palace is properly secured, and the interterritorial situation has settled, I want to go back to the archive and finish what I started." "Of course," he said. "I want to understand the full history," she said. "The Silver Shore. My father's line, what happened to everyone. Not just what affected me, all of it." "I know," he said. "And I want to do something with what I find," she said. "Not politically, not strategically, something that—" She stopped, looking for the right word. "Something that honors them, the people who were lost. My mother, what she carried and what it cost." He was very still and very attentive, and his face was open, in the way she had come to know meant he was not managing his response, but simply receiving what she said. "I would like to hear that," he said quietly, "when you know what it is." She nodded. She looked at him across the small table in the room where she had spent 2 months learning what she was, and she thought about chains and archives and silver blood and a letter folded 4 times in the dust between old survey maps, and she thought about her mother's last line, "If she has found her way to the throne, she is stronger than I knew how to protect her from being." She had found her way to the throne, and she was still standing. That would have to be enough for now. More was coming. She could feel it in the way the silver moved under her skin. Steady now, not pressing, but present, always present, patient, the way it had always been patient. There was still Ward to deal with and Moon's contacts to trace, and Beck's stability to maintain, and Vera's translations to get through, and a dozen other things that were going to require her full attention in the coming weeks. But the vote had happened, and the Silver Shore was real, and her mother had been brave enough to leave a letter in an archive where it would wait for decades to be found, and Calum Draskin was sitting 3 feet away from her looking at her the way he looked at things he had decided not to lose. She breathed. Tomorrow there would be more. There was always more. Today, in this room, in this moment, this was enough. The 7th day after the council session began, without any of the warning signs Seraphine had been watching for, which was the first sign that something was wrong. She had spent the week in a state of focused readiness, working with Vera on the advanced archive texts each morning, meeting with Calum in the evenings to review the intelligence coming back from the people watching Ward's territory, tracking Aldrich Moon's movements through the reports Corin compiled. Moon had made no contact that they could identify, which should have reassured her. Instead, the silence made her alert, in the specific way that absence makes you alert. Not the absence of danger, but the absence of information about danger. On the morning of the 7th day, she told Fenwick she wanted to walk the outer corridor. He accompanied her without comment, and she moved through the palace slowly, not looking at anything in particular, using the same attention she had used looking at the alphas in the courtyard. The broad, unfocused observation that caught things you would miss if you looked directly. She moved through the main corridor, the east wing, the service passage behind the kitchen that she had mapped in her first 2 weeks. She found it in the service passage. Not evidence of something. The thing itself. A small cloth packet, tucked against the wall at the junction where the service passage met the older storage corridor. The packet was unremarkable. The kind of thing that might be a bundle of herbs or spices waiting for collection. She would have walked past it if she had not noticed, very slightly, that the wall beside it was cleaner than the surrounding stone. Cleaned recently, specifically at the height and angle of someone who had reached in to place something there. She called Fenwick, and he looked at where she pointed and said, "Do not touch it." He was right, she knew. She had not intended to. He sealed the area and sent for Vera. Vera arrived, examined it without touching it, and had a small sample extracted by the most cautious method she had ever seen him use. He went to his laboratory. She waited. He came back 2 hours later, and his face told her before he spoke. "It is not a suppression compound," he said. She looked at him. "It is a dispersal agent," he said, "designed to become airborne when exposed to the ambient heat of the passage. Something that has been burning for the past hour has been distributing it through the corridor ventilation system." She understood before he said the next part. "It does not affect the silver property," he said quietly. "It affects the field extension, the ability to extend the silver outward, the anchor effect. It disrupts the mechanism." "For how long?" she said. "Unknown," he said. "The compound is not in any text I have access to. It is either very new or very old and very rare." She stood very still. The silver was still moving under her skin, she could feel it, but when she reached for the extension, the outward press, she felt a resistance she had not felt since before the suppression broke. Not total, not complete, but enough that she would not be able to reach the radius she had held in the courtyard. "Someone," she said, "anticipated the council outcome and adjusted accordingly." Ward had not tried to suppress her blood this time. He had targeted the specific ability that made her a strategic asset. He had learned from the previous attempts. She told Calum in the study that afternoon. She told him everything. The packet, Vera's analysis, the partial disruption of the extension field. She told him plainly, without managing the information, because he needed the complete picture to act correctly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him do the same thing she had already done, moving through the implications, identifying what had changed, calculating what it meant for what was coming. "The packet means Moon had help," he said. "Someone placed it, and someone ensured he would not need to be there to do it. Someone with direct access to the service passage," she said, "which is not restricted. Any staff member can access it. But someone who knew the ventilation pattern well enough to position it correctly. Which narrows it to maintenance staff or someone they briefed," Calum said. "Possibly the same person from the archive," she said, "or a different one. Ward has been building for 20 years. He has had time to place people carefully." The challenge of the next part of the conversation was something she felt before she had the words for it, and she took a moment to ensure she had the words correctly before she spoke. The disruption is partial, she said. I can still extend the field within a reduced radius, not the full range I had in the courtyard, but within approximately 40 feet. That is still significant, Calum said. Yes, she said. But if Ward is planning something that requires a crowd, something designed to create sufficient disorder that a targeted action can take place within it, 40 feet is only useful if I can get close enough. He was looking at her with the careful, complete attention she was most familiar with. You think he is planning an event, he said. I think he has given up on quiet methods, she said. The council, the archive, the corridor, all quiet, all failed. A man with 20 years of preparation, who has exhausted quiet methods, does not simply give up. He makes noise. Calum stood and walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard. And she knew from the set of his shoulders that he was running the same calculation she had been running since Vera's report. The possible events, the available occasions, the window of time in which Ward could still act before his own council alignment began to show strain. There is a pack convening scheduled in 12 days, he said. Semi-annual, held here at the Iron Throne. Open attendance, all packs, traditional. I know, she said. She had read the calendar in her first week. Every pack in the territory sends representatives. Several hundred wolves in the palace grounds. Ward will attend, Calum said. He always does. He uses the convening to work his coalition contacts. Several hundred wolves, she said. With the anchor field disrupted to 40 feet, and Ward, with 12 days to arrange whatever he is planning. She looked at Calum's back. We need to know what it is before it happens. He turned. Moon, he said. Moon is our current visibility into Ward's operations inside the palace, she said. But Moon is very careful, and has not made any identifiable contact in 7 days, which means either he is waiting, or his communications are happening in a way we are not tracking. Calum was quiet for a moment. We stop watching him, he said. We bring him in. She considered it. The information advantage of continuing surveillance versus the information that direct interrogation might yield. If we bring him in before the convening, Ward loses his inside contact and knows he has. He may accelerate whatever he is planning. If we do not bring him in, we have a man inside the palace who is actively working against us with 12 days to do damage, Calum said. She turned it over. Bring him in, she said. But do it quietly, and before you do, have someone place a message in his drop point. Something that will be relayed back to Ward, something that looks like a routine status update. He looked at her. What kind of message? False information, she said. Something Ward will find useful enough to delay his own plans while he repositions around it. What false information? She thought carefully. The message needed to be plausible, actionable, from Ward's perspective, and wrong in a direction that bought them time without creating a different problem. Tell him the field disruption worked completely, she said. That my extension ability is fully gone, not partially. That I am distressed by the loss of it, and that there is tension between me and the court as a result. He was quiet for a moment. He will move sooner if he thinks you are weakened, he said. He will move on a timeline he believes is advantageous, she said. Which will not be as long as 12 days. If he moves in the next 3 or 4 days, we are in a better position than if he moves during the convening, with several hundred wolves on the grounds. Calum held her gaze for a moment. That is a significant risk to accept. All the options involve risk, she said. This is the one where we control the timing. Another pause, not uncertainty. She had learned the difference between his pause for calculation and his pause for doubt. This was calculation. All right, he said. Give me the exact wording of the message. She wrote it that evening in the study, while Calum coordinated the approach to Moon's drop point and the preparation for the detention. Corin handled the placement himself, which she appreciated. It was done by the end of the evening. Moon was brought in the next morning. She was not present for the questioning. She had not asked to be, which she thought was the correct call. What happened in that room was the domain of the king's authority and the court's investigative process, and her presence would have complicated both. She waited in her room and read and let the morning pass. Fenwick came mid-morning. He is cooperating, he said simply. She nodded, reluctantly or voluntarily. Voluntarily, Fenwick said. He apparently had been uncomfortable for some time. She thought about that. A man who was recruited through intellectual interest in old bloodline texts, placed in a position of access, and then asked to facilitate physical attempts against a person. Aldrich Moon was a researcher, not the kind of person who had expected to become what he had become. That specific discomfort was useful. By the afternoon, they had what they needed. Ward had a contact in the Iron Throne's military staff. Not a guard, not someone in the standard security structure. A man in the logistics division who handled supply and movement of resources for large palace events. His name was Gareth Blaine, and he had been in position for 4 years, and what Ward had asked him to arrange for the convening was not something subtle. She sat in the study, with Calum and Vera and Corin, and looked at the written summary of what Moon had disclosed, and she felt the cold, clear certainty of understanding a situation completely. Ward was not going to try to take her. He had given up on that. He was going to create a disruption large enough to discredit the Iron Throne's ability to provide stability, force the convening into chaos, and use the chaos to push through an emergency interterritorial referendum, a mechanism that bypassed the standard council vote by requiring only a 2/3 agreement among all attending PAC representatives, not just the 6 senior alphas. With several hundred PAC representatives present, Ward's 20 years of coalition building could produce a 2/3 majority that the senior council had denied him. He changed the mechanism, Calum said. He is adaptable, she said. This is why he has held his position for 20 years. What does the disruption look like? Vera asked. She looked at the summary. Gareth Blaine had been tasked with ensuring a structural failure in the main convening hall's support system during the formal opening assembly. Not catastrophic, not designed to hurt anyone, designed to create panic, confusion, and the specific emotional conditions in which people voted for security over principle. We remove Blaine tonight, Calum said. We do, she agreed. And then we tell the alphas what Ward planned before the convening begins. Publicly? Corin asked. Publicly, she said. In front of every representative. Ward cannot respond to public disclosure with another private mechanism. He has to respond publicly. And every response he makes publicly narrows what he can do next. Calum looked at her with the expression she thought of as his most honest, not the controlled king, not the careful strategist, but the person underneath, who was looking at her the way you look at someone whose judgment you have stopped second-guessing. You are going to end this at the convening, he said. I am going to try, she said. What do you need? She took a breath. I need Vera to work on the disruption compound every available hour between now and the convening, she said. If there is any way to reverse the field effect, even partially, I want it reversed before the hall is full. Vera nodded without hesitation. I need Corin to map the convening hall and give me every possible position from which 40 feet of radius covers the highest concentration of attending wolves, she said. Tonight, Corin said. She looked at Calum. And I need you to trust that I know what I am doing when the moment comes, without trying to protect me from it. He held her gaze. The lamp between them was steady, and the room was quiet. And outside the window, the night was settled and dark. I will try, he said. Good, she said. That is all I am asking. She went back to her room and stood at the window and looked at the courtyard below and felt the silver moving in her, steady and patient, and she pressed her hand against her own chest and felt it press back, and she was not afraid. 12 days had become 7 since Blaine was confirmed. 7 days to prepare. She had worked with less time and fewer resources, and no knowledge of what she was. This time she had all of it. She would be ready. Vera worked through the first 4 nights without sleeping. She brought him food twice, and he ate without looking up from the texts, which she took as the most productive response available to the situation. He was working through the 3rd of the archaic documents she had wanted him to translate. The one that Moon's investigation had confirmed contained the most detailed technical description of how silver extension worked, and, theoretically, what could disrupt it. On the 5th day he came to her room before the morning meeting. He had found something. She could see it in his face, not triumph, which was not an expression Vera was equipped for, but the particular quality of a man who has found the answer to a question that has been absorbing him completely and is still deciding what the answer means. The disruption compound works by interrupting the interface between the silver property and the carrier's voluntary extension function, he said, without preamble, sitting down across from her while she was still drinking her morning tea. It does not affect the silver itself. It affects the mechanism by which the carrier directs it outward deliberately. She set her tea down. Is there a way around it? The compound disrupts voluntary extension, he said. It does not disrupt involuntary extension. She was quiet for a moment. What is involuntary extension? The field that extends when the carrier is not directing it, he said. In the early texts, the first line did not always control the extension actively. The anchor effect, the settling, the stabilization of wolf nature in others, was described in some accounts as automatic, not something that required effort. She thought about the afternoon in the courtyard, how she had let go, stopped holding, stopped managing, and the silver had extended not through effort, but through the cessation of effort. I was not directing it that day, she said. I was simply not stopping it. Exactly, Vera said. And the compound cannot interfere with what is not being directed. It can block the intentional reach. It cannot block what simply is. She sat with this for a moment. It was not a perfect solution. Uncontrolled extension, in a hall full of several hundred wolves, was not the same as carefully placed, precisely directed extension. It would be large and undiscriminating. That might, she thought, be exactly what the situation called for. How wide? She asked. Unknown, he said, but the involuntary field, in cases documented before the hunts, was described as extending further than the voluntary one. The voluntary field requires energy to sustain. The involuntary one simply is. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You are going to stop holding it, he said. In a room full of several hundred pack representatives, and 6 senior alphas, and Kaysen Ward, she said. Yes. He was quiet. That is not nothing, he said. No, she agreed. But Ward structured his plan to exploit the disruption of the voluntary field. He is not planning for the other one. She looked at Vera. He studied Moonblood in the theoretical paper you wrote 30 years ago. He has been working from the understanding your research gave him. What part of your paper described involuntary extension? Vera paused. None of it, he said. I did not know about involuntary extension 30 years ago. Then Ward does not know either, she said. The remaining 3 days were the most precisely organized days of her life. Corin gave her the positioning maps of the convening hall, and she studied them until she could visualize every pillar and doorway and seating arrangement. Calum coordinated with Edmund Gale by secure message and briefed the 2 alphas who had flipped at the council, Farrow and Beck, through trusted intermediaries. Gareth Blaine was taken into custody without incident, and with sufficient care that the arrest was not visible to the other pack representatives arriving for the convening. On the evening before the convening, she sat in her room alone for 1 hour. She did not review strategy or maps or notes. She sat, and she breathed, and she turned her attention entirely inward, to the place where the silver lived, the deep structural foundation she had spent 21 years not knowing was there. She felt it the way you feel something you have always carried, but have only recently named. Present, warm, patient, older than anything she could fully comprehend, and yet entirely, specifically hers. She thought about her mother, and about a letter placed in an archive with the patient faith that the right person would eventually find it. She thought about Calum Draskin telling a man named Harlan Beck that he had not trusted anyone fully in 9 years, and was doing it now. She thought about Vera, who had been looking for the answer to a question for 30 years, and had found it wearing worn boots and sitting in a stone room eating bread. She thought about Corin, who always asked if she was all right, and Fenwick, who was efficient and loyal, in the completely uncomplicated way of someone who has decided where his values sit, and acts accordingly. She had come here with nothing. She was going into tomorrow with more than she could have imagined. She was ready. Calum came just before the night hour. He knocked. This was new. He had not knocked before. She said, "Come in," and he did. And he stood in the room, with his hands at his sides, and his face doing the open, unhurried thing that she had learned to love. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I am going to say something that I would ordinarily not say the night before a significant event," he said, "because I believe it is more important to say it correctly than to say it at the most strategically ideal moment." She waited. "You changed everything when you came here," he said. "Not just the court, not just the political situation. I am not speaking about strategy." He held her gaze with the full, steady attention that was the most characteristic thing about him. I want you to know that, before tomorrow, and separately from everything tomorrow contains. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was soft between them, and the palace was settling into its night sounds, and she was 21 years old, and she had been called Hollow for as long as she could remember, and the Alpha King of the Iron Throne was looking at her like she was the most solid thing he had ever stood next to. I know, she said quietly. You changed things for me too. He nodded. He stayed standing there for a moment longer, and she thought he might say something more, and then he said, Sleep well. You too, she said. He left. She lay down and closed her eyes, and the silver moved steadily beneath her skin, and she thought, tomorrow. She slept. Outside the window the moon was high and full, and the courtyard below was silver with it, and in the rooms and corridors and great halls of the Iron Throne's palace, several hundred wolves from every territory in the known world were settling into their accommodations and preparing for a convening that would begin at dawn, and not one of them knew what was about to happen in that hall. Not one of them except the wolfless girl who had come here in chains and had spent 2 months finding out that hollow was never the right word. She had always been the origin point. Tomorrow, the world was going to know it. The convening hall had been built 200 years ago for exactly this purpose, to hold the assembled representatives of every pack in the known territory, to give them a space large enough to breathe in and formal enough to take seriously. Its ceiling was 30 feet high, and its walls were dark stone, and the light came through long narrow windows set high in the walls that filled the space with a cold, clean morning light that flattered nothing and concealed nothing. By the time the formal opening was called to begin, there were 341 wolves in that hall. She had asked Corin for the exact number, and he had given it to her. She stood to the right of the main floor, near the second pillar from the front, in the position she had identified from the map as the optimal point from which a 40-foot radius covered the highest concentration of the hall. She was not at the formal table. She was not presenting. She was not announced. She was simply there, in plain clothes, with Fenwick at her shoulder and the silver moving quietly beneath her skin, and she waited. Calum opened the convening in the traditional formal language, and then, before the first item of standard business, he said, Before the regular agenda, I have an announcement relevant to the security of this gathering and the integrity of the interterritorial process. The hall, which had the low background noise of 341 wolves in a large space, went quiet in stages. He spoke for 7 minutes. He described the council vote and what had prompted it. He described the 2 attempts inside the palace. He named Aldrich Moon and the Greymount Pack connection. He described Gareth Blaine and what he had been positioned to do at this gathering. He did not editorialize. He presented the information in sequence, calmly and completely, the way you present information that you trust to speak for itself. She watched Ward while this happened. He was at the front, in a position appropriate to a senior alpha. He had had no warning that this was coming. The false message to Moon's drop point had told him the field disruption was complete, and his contact inside the palace was already in custody, and there had been no leak that she was aware of that would have reached him before this morning. He sat with the composed, collected stillness of a man who was making real-time calculations about a situation that had departed significantly from his planning. He was thinking about options. She could see it, not in his face, which remained controlled, but in the very slight shift of his weight, the fraction of repositioning that happened when a person is mentally rapid cycling through alternatives. When Calum finished, the hall erupted. Not in anger. In the particular loud confusion of several hundred people who have all received significant information simultaneously, and are each trying to understand it in the context of what they personally knew before this moment. The sound was enormous, a wave of voices and movement, and inside it people turned to neighbors and asked questions, and received answers that were themselves guesses, and the hall became for several minutes the specific organized chaos of a large gathering processing a shock. Ward stood. He had a voice that carried, not because it was loud, it was not loud, but because he used it with the precision of a man who had spent decades in rooms like this one, and the particular quality of it cut through the noise the way that precision does. He said, "The King of the Iron Throne has presented a serious series of allegations without producing the individuals named or the documentation supporting his claims." The noise reduced. He had done that deliberately and efficiently. She noted it. "I would suggest," Ward continued, That the gravity of what has been claimed requires a process, not an announcement. That the allegations against Greymount Pack be reviewed by a neutral body, and that the individual at the center of these events, a person of unknown standing and no pack affiliation, be removed from this hall while that process is undertaken. He looked directly at her as he said the last part. 341 wolves followed his gaze to where she stood. She had planned for this moment. She had thought through what she would do at this point, which was to speak, to say what needed to be said, formally and publicly, in the way she had said it to the council. She had the words ready. She had prepared them carefully. She did not use them. She simply stopped holding. She did not reach outward. She did not extend deliberately. She simply stopped the long, lifelong habit of management, the careful containment that her mother had begun with a ritual, and that she had continued, unconsciously, by training herself for 21 years to be smaller and quieter and less than she was. And she let everything she was simply be present in the room with 341 wolves, who all carried, in their blood, in the deep structure of what made them what they were, a fraction of what she carried at full convergence. The hall did not go silent, it went still. Those are different things. Silent is the absence of sound. Still is something happening underneath sound, something that does not require the cessation of noise but simply arrives beneath it and is felt before it is registered. It moved through the hall the way a deep sound moves through water, slower than air, reaching further, touching things that are not at the surface. Every wolf in that room felt it. She watched it happen with her full attention, the way she watched everything, cataloging what she saw. Near her, a woman who had been turned to speak to her neighbor stopped mid-word and then stayed still, not in confusion, but in something she could only describe later, as recognition. A man near the back who had been moving toward the door stopped and stood with his hand on a pillar and his face turned upward, the way animals turn their faces toward a scent they have never encountered, but know instantly as important. At the front table, Edmund Gale sat back in his seat, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes closed for a moment. Not submission, not the reflexive response of a wolf to alpha command, but something quieter and older, the response of something in him that was below decision, below rank, below 20 years of pack politics and careful coalition management. Near Gale, Cassia Holt had gone very still and was looking at Seraphine with the expression of someone who has just understood something they had been trying to understand for their entire life and had never previously had the language for. And Cason Ward. Ward was standing, and he was looking at her, and for the first time since he had walked into this palace, and this gathering, and this situation, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had prepared thoroughly, for the first time, something in his face was not controlled. She had wondered, in the days before this moment, what it would look like. She had thought it might look like fear. She had thought it might look like anger. What it actually looked like was simpler and more complete than either of those. It was the expression of someone who has spent 20 years building an argument in his mind, assembling evidence and strategy, and coalition support for a position he had convinced himself was correct, and has just encountered the thing itself, the actual thing, not the idea of it, and understood, without being able to argue himself out of the understanding, that the position was wrong. Not wrong because someone told him so, wrong because his wolf was on the floor. Not theatrically, not with collapse or noise. His wolf, the deep, animal part of him that had been an alpha wolf for decades and had submitted to nothing in that time, had simply gone quiet in the presence of what she was. The way everything that had come from the source goes quiet when it encounters the source. Ward remained standing. He remained controlled. He was a man of discipline, and he was not going to lose his composure in front of 300 people. But something had happened in him that she could see from where she stood, and everyone near him could see it, and he knew they could see it, and there was nothing he could do about it. She spoke. She had not planned to speak now. She had planned to speak earlier, and had changed the plan, but this was the moment, and she used it. "Cason Ward," she said, and her voice in the still hall was not loud and was heard everywhere. "You have spent 20 years preparing for me. You knew what I was before I did. You found the files, placed the people, built the coalition, tried the quiet methods when the direct ones were not available to you." The hall was very, very still. "I understand why," she said. "What I am, is a challenge to the foundation your authority is built on. Every alpha in this room knows what I mean, because every wolf in this room is feeling right now what happens when the origin of their nature is present in full. She looked at him steadily. You tried to suppress it, you tried to contain it, you tried to use the institutions of the pack world to remove it before it could be fully what it is. She paused. All of that failed, not because you made mistakes. You are a careful man, and you did not make many. It failed because what I am cannot be suppressed, or contained, or institutionally removed. Not because I am more powerful than the system, but because I am what the system came from. Ward said nothing. The hall said nothing. I am not here to dismantle what you have built, she said. I am not the enemy of the pack world. I came here in chains, 2 months ago, believing I was nothing, because that is what every person in my life had told me for 21 years. I know now what I actually am, and what I actually am has no interest in taking what anyone has earned. I have no territory. I have no title. I have no army. I have nothing that looks like power from the outside. She let that sit for a moment. What I have, she said, is what you all carry a fraction of. And I am standing here, in this room, with 341 wolves who came from what I carry, and I am asking you to make a different choice than the one Cason Ward has been building toward. Not for me. For the same reason an anchor holds, not because it is stronger than the storm, but because the ground beneath it has never moved. The silence lasted for a long time. Then Edmund Gale stood. He did not say anything formal. He did not make a procedural move or invoke a mechanism. He simply stood, and the alpha of Westbridge Pack, standing in this context, was a statement that required no words. Cassia Holt stood. Harlan Beck stood. The 2 alphas who had voted with Ward at the council, Pharaoh and the 5th, stood. And then, in the way these things move through a room when they have found their direction, the representatives began to stand, not all at once, in clusters, by row, from the front to the back of the hall. The wolves of the known world stood, and the sound of it was not cheering or shouting. It was 300 chairs, and 4 years of held breath, and the particular sound of a room deciding something together. Ward sat down. Not dramatically, not with any visible concession. He simply sat down and looked at the table in front of him, with the composed, contained expression of a man who is not finished, but who is also not foolish enough to continue a fight in a room that has made its decision. Calum was at the front of the hall. He had been watching her from the moment she stopped holding, and she had been aware of his eyes on her the same way she was always aware of where he was in a room. Specific, particular awareness that was not strategy. He was looking at her now with an expression that had moved through several things and arrived somewhere she did not try to analyze, because it would have required looking away from what was happening in the room, and she was not willing to look away. Later. She had told herself later, and she had been right to, and later was getting very close. The formal business of the convening proceeded. The agenda moved through its provisions. Ward remained for all of it, and performed the necessary participations of his role, with the precise, controlled efficiency of someone who had decided to be professional. She did not look at him again. She had said what she had to say, and she had no interest in watching him manage his loss. When the formal close was called, and the hall began to move, she stood at the pillar, and let the movement happen around her. Wolves passed, and several of them looked at her, and some of them stopped for a moment, and one of them, a young man she did not know, from a pack she had not heard of, with the nervous energy of someone who has something he needs to say, and is making himself say it, stopped in front of her and said, I was in Iron Moon, 2 summers ago. I heard them talk about you. He stopped. I am sorry. She looked at him. He was not much older than she was, and whatever he had heard in Iron Moon had stayed with him long enough that he had recognized her, and had decided, in the middle of a significant political moment, to say that one thing. Thank you, she said. He nodded and moved on. Fenwick was at her shoulder. Corin had appeared at the edge of the hall's entrance. Edmund Gale paused and said simply, Well done, for the second time, and she said, Well done to you, because he had been the first one standing. And Calum. He came through the clearing hall toward her without hurrying, the way he moved through everything, not with performance, not with ceremony, just with the direct, unhurried intention of someone who knows what he is walking toward. He stopped in front of her, and the hall was nearly empty, and the morning light from the high windows was falling between them on the stone floor. "Is it over?" she asked. She meant Ward, and the immediate threat, and the specific shape of what they had been working toward. "This part," he said. She looked at him. "And the rest of it?" He was looking at her with the full, open, unhurried attention that she had catalogued and stored and named, and was done being careful around. "The rest of it," he said, "is a different conversation." She said, "I know." She looked up at him. "I am ready to have it." They stood in the nearly empty convening hall with the morning light on the stone around them, and the silver moving steadily in her blood, and the old thing that had been patient for 21 years, simply present. Simply itself, simply here. And the Alpha King of the Iron Throne looked at the girl who had arrived in his palace, in chains, and had no wolf, and had been called hollow her entire life, and had turned out to be the origin point of everything his world was built on. And he said, "You were never without a wolf. Every wolf that has ever existed came from what you carry." She said, "I know that now." He said, "I know. I just wanted to say it." She said, "Calum." He said, "Yes." She said, "Stop talking." He did. What happened in that moment in the convening hall was not observed by anyone who later reported on it formally, which was exactly as it should have been. What was observed, by Corin waiting at the entrance and Fenwick at the pillar and Edmund Gale still moving through the far doorway, was simpler and more complete. The most powerful alpha in the known world, standing in front of a young woman with silver light at the edges of her skin, and neither of them looking at anything else in the world. The pack representatives who filed out of the hall that morning and into the courtyard of the Iron Throne went back to their territories in the following days and told different versions of what they had felt in that room. Some described it as peace, which was not quite right, but was in the neighborhood. Some described it as recognition, which was closer. Some did not have a word for it, and said simply that they had felt, for a moment, that everything was in its correct position, and they could not afterward explain why that feeling had been accompanied by the image of a young woman, standing in the morning light, next to a stone pillar. The story moved through the pack world the way significant things move, faster than official channels and already changed by the time it arrived at most destinations. In Ironmoon, it arrived first through Owen, who had been at the convening, and who went home and told people what he had seen, and who was notably less certain of himself while telling it than he had been on the back of a cart 2 months earlier. In a monastery, 3 territories away, an elderly woman named Lyra received a letter she had been waiting for, without knowing its exact shape. She read it and sat with it for a long time, and then she held it against her heart and closed her eyes and thought of Elena, and she said thank you to the specific, long-held hope that she had carried for 21 years, alongside Elena's secret. In the lower archive of the Iron Throne, the small, narrow book that had been waiting between 2 larger ones on the 3rd shelf was finally removed and placed, by Seraphine herself, on the afternoon of the day after the convening, into a proper case with a record of its discovery and provenance. Beside it she placed her mother's letter, and beside that, she placed the first of the translations Vera had completed of the archaic technical texts. She labeled the case carefully in her own handwriting. First line archive. Primary documents. Cross-reference. Ashwood, Elena. Silver Shore records. Bloodline convergence. Documented. She closed the case, and set it on the shelf, and stood back, and looked at it. Vera came in while she was standing there. He looked at the case, and at her, and then at the shelf around it, which already had 3 more documents waiting that she had identified that morning. "It is going to fill several more shelves before we have all of it," he said. "I know," she said. "We have time." He looked at her with the expression she thought of as his most complete, the one with everything in it, the long search and the finding of it, and the particular strange comfort of a man who has arrived at the answer he spent his whole life looking for. "Yes," he said, "we have time." She stayed in the archive until the late afternoon. She read and she arranged, and she began the catalog that would eventually be the most complete record of first-line history in the known world, and she let the silver move in her as it always moved now, steady and warm and present, not demanding, simply here, the way the foundation of a building is simply here, not noticed when things are good but there, always there, when anything needs to stand. When she came up from the archive, the palace was in the golden late light of early evening, and Fenwick was at the door, and Corin was in the corridor, and she walked through the familiar halls with the particular ease of someone who has learned where they belong. She had come here in chains. She was here now. She was exactly and entirely where she was supposed to be.